Have you ever wondered what it's like to fall asleep as Rick turns Morty's reality into a Cronenberg nightmare? Our brains process information differently when we're drifting off, making twisted timelines strangely comforting in those pre-sleep moments. This 2.5-hour journey through Rick and Morty's most reality-bending adventures isn't just another compilation. It's specifically sequenced to create a unique sleep experience, where interdimensional chaos somehow becomes your perfect bedtime story. The multiverse theory never felt so cozy. What if I told you the original Cronenberg disaster wasn't even Rick's most catastrophic timeline mistake? That iconic moment from Season 1, Episode 6, Rick Potion Number 9, marks the first time we see Rick completely abandon a reality after messing it up beyond repair. The episode starts simple enough. Morty has a crush on Jessica and wants Rick to make him a love potion for the school dance. And Rick, being Rick, agrees to this clearly terrible idea without much hesitation. The love potion Rick creates is based on vole hormones, which, as he explains, makes the target fall madly in love with the first person they see. It's a seemingly straightforward concept that goes wrong in the most complicated way possible. What Rick doesn't account for is Jessica having the flu, which causes the potion to mutate and spread through the school dance like a virus. This is where we first see Rick's scientific brilliance paired with his dangerous lack of caution. He understands genetic manipulation well enough to create an instant love potion, but doesn't bother testing it for potential complications or side effects. In this episode, the animation team creates a false sense of security in the first half. The color palette stays bright, the character movements remain fluid and normal, and the disasters seem fixable. We even see Rick attempt a solution with his mantis DNA counter serum, which he mixes while showing a brief moment of uncertainty. His hand shakes slightly when adding the final ingredient, an easy-to-miss detail that foreshadows the disaster to come. These subtle animation clues prepare us for the shift that happens when things really start falling apart. The transformation of the entire world population into what Rick calls Cronenbergs represents the first time we see permanent consequences in a show that initially seemed like it would reset at the end of each episode. The turning point comes when Rick's third attempt at a fix causes everyone except the Smiths to transform into mantis-human hybrids that want to mate with and then eat Morty. Rick's solution to this problem creates an even bigger disaster. Everyone in the world becomes deformed, blob-like creatures with multiple limbs and distorted features. The sound design during this sequence changes dramatically, from the normal background music to distorted, unsettling tones that grow more chaotic as the world does. We see Rick working through potential solutions in his lab, muttering formulas and possibilities, while the background gradually fills with news reports of worldwide chaos. This scene gives us a clear picture of how Rick processes failure. He keeps trying until he can't anymore, then immediately looks for an escape route. His face shows increasing stress as he realizes the scale of his mistake, eventually leading to the now famous moment where he turns to Morty and says flatly, "Your DNA can be combined with anything, Morty. That's why I can't make you and Jessica work." This line works on two levels, as both a scientific explanation and as Rick's admission of complete defeat. The original Cronenberg world isn't just a throwaway plot point. It continues to exist after Rick and Morty leave it. In fact, it becomes the most twisted timeline in the entire series because it remains permanently altered with no chance of recovery. The people transformed into monsters develop their own society and culture, as we see in later episodes when the show occasionally checks in on that abandoned reality. What makes it more disturbing is that the original Beth, Jerry, and Summer continue living there, adapting to their new world of monsters while thinking their Rick and Morty died in an explosion. This timeline abandonment establishes one of the core themes of the series: Rick's cavalier attitude toward reality itself. He doesn't try to save the world he destroyed or help the family he's leaving behind. Instead, he finds a nearly identical reality where he and Morty have recently died in an accident and simply takes their place. The casual way Rick explains this to Morty is chilling. We can only do this a couple of times because there's only so many realities where we die at that exact moment. This implies he's done this before and has calculated exactly how many escape hatches he has available. The episode ends with what might be the most emotionally significant scene in the early seasons: Rick and Morty burying their own bodies in the backyard. The camera lingers on Morty's traumatized expression as he processes what's happening. The music here shifts to a somber piano piece that emphasizes the psychological weight of literally burying yourself and taking over another version of your life. Rick tries to brush it off, saying, "Don't think about it," but Morty clearly can't stop thinking about it, and neither can the audience. What makes the Cronenberg world the most twisted timeline isn't just the physical transformation of humanity, but the casual way it's abandoned. Other disasters throughout the series get fixed, reversed, or at least addressed, but this original catastrophe is simply left behind like garbage. The show later reveals that the abandoned Smith family actually adapts quite well to the monster-filled world, with Jerry, Beth, and Summer becoming hardened survivors who are arguably happier and more fulfilled than their counterparts in the main timeline. The lasting impact of this episode extends throughout the entire series. The crack in the driveway that appears after Rick and Morty bury their alternate selves becomes a permanent feature in all future episodes. A small but constant visual reminder that we're not watching the original timeline anymore. This subtle detail helps viewers keep track of which reality we're following, a necessary anchor in a show that jumps between dimensions. The Cronenberg disaster establishes a pattern that we'll see repeated throughout the series. Rick destroying realities and moving on without real consequences for himself. It's especially significant because it happens so early in the show, teaching viewers that nothing is sacred and no status quo is permanent. The sound of Rick's portal gun becomes both a sign of freedom and escape, but also of avoidance and abandonment. What makes this particular timeline situation more disturbing than later catastrophes is that it was preventable at multiple points. Rick could have refused to make the love potion, tested it properly, created a more effective antidote, or even stayed to help fix the world he ruined. Instead, he demonstrates a pattern that defines his character. Brilliant problem-solving until the problem becomes too big, then complete abandonment in favor of an easier solution. When Rick and Morty step through that green portal in the garage and arrive in the new reality, we're witnessing the exact moment the show transforms from a wacky sci-fi comedy into something darker and more philosophically complex. The casual disposal of an entire reality establishes the true stakes of Rick's adventures, not just danger to the main characters, but existential consequences for entire universes. And as we see Rick and Morty digging graves for their alternate selves, we understand that even if they physically survive their adventures, parts of who they are die along the way, replaced by the experiences that haunt them across the multiverse. Ever notice how casually Rick and Morty step over their own dead bodies to continue living in a replacement dimension? That scene of them burying themselves in the backyard actually represents one of the biggest psychological turning points in the entire series. We watch Morty silently digging, his face blank yet clearly processing something massive, while Rick treats the situation like it's just a minor inconvenience. This moment doesn't just set up the rest of the episode. It permanently alters how both characters approach their existence across all future seasons. The psychological impact of literally burying yourself is something the show doesn't immediately explain, but instead lets viewers process alongside Morty. When Rick explains they're taking over the lives of versions of themselves that just died, he presents it as a simple solution. "Here's the formula," he essentially tells Morty. "When we mess up bad enough, we just find a timeline where we died and replace ourselves." For Rick, this is just basic multiverse manipulation. But for Morty, it's an existential crisis happening in real time. The camera lingers on Morty's face throughout this sequence, showing his growing understanding that his identity isn't as solid as he once believed. What makes this scene particularly significant is the stark contrast between Rick and Morty's reactions. Rick handles the body burial with complete emotional detachment. He's whistling while digging, treating it like a mundane chore, even commenting, "That's why I always wear blue pants when some dirt gets on his clothes." Meanwhile, Morty is visibly shaken, barely speaking, and taking long pauses between shovel movements. This contrast reveals their fundamentally different approaches to timeline hopping. Rick sees identities as interchangeable parts in the cosmic machine, while Morty still views himself as a continuous, singular person whose experiences matter. This experience adds a permanent layer of existential awareness to Morty's character that follows him through all future episodes. Before burying himself, Morty was often naive and complained about Rick's adventures, but primarily from a place of inconvenience or fear. After this event, his complaints take on a deeper philosophical dimension. In later episodes, we see him questioning the nature of identity itself, like in Morty Night Run, when he asks Rick which one of his memories is real. The uncertainty of which version of himself he truly is becomes a recurring theme in Morty's development, creating a character who grows increasingly comfortable with existential uncertainty. The show's creators make sure we don't forget we're in a replacement dimension through subtle visual cues. The most obvious is the crack in the driveway that appears after this episode. This crack remains consistent throughout all future episodes, appearing in establishing shots of the house and occasionally even being referenced by characters. It serves as a constant reminder that we're not watching the original Smith family anymore, but replacements living in a borrowed reality. Other visual markers include minor differences in the house's interior decoration and the slightly altered appearances of background characters at Morty's school. The musical choices around this timeline switch also create emotional continuity throughout the series. When Rick and Morty first arrive in their replacement dimension, a somber piano melody plays that contrasts sharply with the usual energetic synth themes. This same musical motif returns in later episodes whenever the show references this timeline jump, like in Morty's Mind Blowers, when we see a memory of Morty crying about burying himself. The composers use these recurring themes to trigger emotional recall in the audience, connecting moments across seasons that deal with identity replacement. This timeline replacement establishes one of the show's core philosophical themes. Identity is fluid across infinite realities. The idea that Rick and Morty can simply step into the lives of alternate versions of themselves questions the very concept of a continuous self. Are they still the same people if they're living in different bodies in a different universe? The show doesn't provide easy answers, but instead uses this question as a foundation for exploring how both characters view themselves. Rick embraces the fluidity, seeing all versions of himself as essentially interchangeable, while Morty struggles with the implications for his sense of self. The evidence of Morty's lingering trauma from this experience appears in numerous later episodes. In Rick Potion Number 9, immediately after the burial, we see Morty sitting in class staring blankly into space while Jessica talks to him, the very scenario he wanted the love potion for originally. But now he's too traumatized to even care. In Autoerotic Assimilation, Morty references the event when explaining to Summer why she shouldn't look. In a certain drawer, saying, "That's just where Rick and I keep our adventure souvenirs. Don't look in there." His tone suggests he's trying to protect her from the kind of psychological damage he experienced. Most significantly, in the episode Rixie Business, we see Morty take Summer to the backyard and show her the graves, specifically to help her understand the true nature of their grandfather's adventures. What seems like a relatively minor decision, Rick choosing to abandon a timeline rather than fix it, actually becomes one of the most catastrophic splits in the series. Unlike most sci-fi shows where the reset button gets pressed at the episode's end, Rick and Morty permanently abandons an entire universe and its inhabitants. The original Smith family adapts to living in the Croninberg world, eventually becoming apocalypse survivors who are arguably happier than their counterparts. Meanwhile, the Rick and Morty we follow must live with the knowledge that they're replacements, living borrowed lives in a reality where they don't truly belong. This split creates a cascading effect throughout the series, influencing how both characters approach future crises and their willingness to abandon more realities when things go wrong. The psychological weight of this timeline hop becomes even heavier when we consider that Morty was only asking for a love potion, a relatively innocent request compared to most of their adventures. The catastrophic outcome of something so simple teaches him that even minor requests can lead to universe-ending consequences. This changes how Morty approaches asking Rick for help in future episodes, making him more cautious and thoughtful about the potential fallout. The seemingly minor decision to use a love potion on a crush leads to the permanent destruction of his original reality, the death of alternate versions of himself and Rick, and the psychological burden of living someone else's life. In later episodes, Rick occasionally references Croninberg world in passing comments, usually when drunk or particularly honest. In Rick Potion Number 9, he tells Morty they can only perform this reality swap a couple of times, before running out of compatible realities, suggesting this is a limited resource even for Rick. This casual reference to the abandoned timeline and the suggestion that they might need to do it again creates a constant underlying tension in all their adventures. Every time Rick and Morty face a world-ending scenario, viewers remember that abandonment is always on the table as a solution, and the psychological cost that comes with it. The lesson this timeline shift teaches both characters and viewers is profound. In a multiverse of infinite possibilities, identity itself becomes relative. When Rick hands Morty a replacement photo album from their new garage and says, "Same stuff, different versions of us," he's not just explaining their situation, he's introducing the idea that will define much of the show's philosophy going forward. Across infinite realities, the line between self and other blurs until it becomes almost meaningless. And yet, paradoxically, the emotional impact of these switches remains very real and lasting for the characters who experience them. What if the infinite timelines of Rick and Morty aren't actually infinite, but carefully curated by Ricks themselves? Throughout the series, Rick constantly references infinite possibilities across infinite dimensions, but Season 5 finally reveals something that changes everything we thought we knew about the multiverse. The central finite curve isn't just another sci-fi term Rick throws around. It's actually a massive conspiracy created by Ricks across multiple dimensions to wall themselves off from the rest of the multiverse. The concept gets fully explained in the Season 5 finale when Evil Morty reveals that the central finite curve is basically a walled-off section of the multiverse. But here's the important part. It only contains realities where Rick is the smartest person in that universe. This means all the dimension-hopping adventures we've watched for. 5 seasons have been taking place within a carefully controlled environment. The Citadel of Ricks isn't just a government for Ricks, it's the administrative center for this entire sectioned-off portion of reality. This revelation completely changes how we should view earlier episodes. Remember when Rick would boast about having infinite escape routes through infinite dimensions? That wasn't entirely true. He's only able to access dimensions within this curated section of the multiverse. All those times Rick seemed unstoppable and all-knowing, he was actually operating in a system specifically designed to ensure he always had the advantage. It's like learning that someone who claims to be the world's best basketball player only plays on courts where the hoops are lowered just for them. The central finite curve serves as both Rick's playground and his prison. On one hand, it gives him a vast number of realities where he's guaranteed to be the most intelligent being, allowing him to maintain his godlike status and control over situations. But on the other hand, it severely limits which realities he can access. There are countless dimensions outside the curve where Rick isn't special at all, where he might just be an average person, or where beings far more intelligent than him exist. By creating the curve, Rick has traded true infinite possibility for a comfortable bubble where his ego remains intact. When visualizing the multiverse, the animation team uses distinct techniques that suggest incredible complexity. In episodes showing the Citadel or various points along the curve, we see geometric patterns that fold into themselves, shifting color gradients that move from green to purple to blue, and spatial distortions that make dimensional barriers look like translucent membranes. These visual elements create an impression of structured infinity, not random chaos, but something that has been organized and categorized. The opening sequence of The Ricklantis Mix-Up shows hundreds of Ricks and Mortys flowing through portals in an organized system, visually reinforcing the idea that this seemingly infinite multiverse is actually under controlled management. The concept of the central finite curve was actually hinted at long before it was explicitly named. In Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the Council of Ricks mentions protecting the sanctity of the central finite curve without explaining what that actually means. This early reference shows the writers had this concept planned from the beginning. Another subtle hint comes in Season 3, Episode 7, when Rick mentions that the Citadel was built to protect Ricks from the government and other threats. He doesn't specify what those other threats might be, but now we know he was referring to realities where Rick isn't the smartest being. The sound design of the show creates distinct audio signatures for different points along the central finite curve. Dimensions closer to the main timeline have similar background sounds. subtle synthesizer tones, and familiar environmental noises. But as Rick and Morty visit dimensions that stretch toward the edges of the curve, the audio becomes increasingly distorted and alien. In Rick Potion number 9, the Croninberg dimension maintains relatively normal audio until the transformation happens. After that, the background sounds include unsettling organic squelches and distorted human voices. These audio cues help viewers understand where a particular reality sits in relation to others without needing explicit explanation. We see evidence of Rick's growing awareness of his limitations within the central finite curve throughout the series. In Season 3, his confrontation with the President shows him increasingly frustrated with the constraints of operating within known realities. His defeat at the hands of Phoenix Person demonstrates that even within his curated section of the multiverse, he's not invincible. By Season 5, Rick's interactions with beings like Mr. Nimbus reveal his understanding that there are forces within the curve that can match, or even exceed, certain aspects of his abilities. These moments of vulnerability become more frequent as the series progresses, suggesting Rick is pushing against the boundaries of his self-created prison. Rick's understanding of infinite timelines fundamentally shapes his nihilistic behavior and detachment from consequences. Knowing that he exists in a section of the multiverse specifically designed for his advantage gives him a sense of artificial security. If something goes wrong in one dimension, there are countless others within the curve where things went differently. This knowledge makes Rick fundamentally unable to commit to relationships or accept responsibility. Why care about anything when infinite variants exist? His famous "nothing matters" philosophy isn't just existential depression. It's a logical conclusion based on his understanding of his place in a manipulated multiverse. This detachment from consequences explains Rick's behavior in episodes like Rick Potion number 9, where he casually abandons a ruined dimension, or Morty's Mind Blowers, where he erases Morty's memories whenever they become inconvenient. Rick's nihilism isn't philosophical, it's practical. When you know the universe is rigged in your favor and infinite do-overs exist, emotional investment seems pointless. The central finite curve revelation helps us understand that Rick isn't just depressed. He's responding rationally to the artificial reality he helped create. The most disturbing aspect of the central finite curve is that Rick himself participated in creating it. By helping to wall off these realities, he's complicit in limiting his own potential experiences to ones where he remains superior. This suggests his ego is even more fragile than we thought. Rick would rather reign in a limited multiverse than be average in an infinite one. This revelation makes his character simultaneously more understandable and more tragic. He's imprisoned himself in a reality bubble where he can never truly be challenged or grow beyond his current state. When Rick sits Morty down in the garage and explains multiverse theory using that now famous whiteboard drawing, he's not actually explaining the full truth. The diagram shows various realities branching off from central points, but it doesn't reveal that all these branches exist within the artificial boundary of the central finite curve. Rick's explanations of science throughout the show take on a new light with this knowledge. He's always teaching Morty about a version of reality that's been carefully edited to maintain Rick's position at the top of the intellectual hierarchy. The existence of the central finite curve raises the biggest question in the series: what exists beyond it? Evil Morty's plan to break through this barrier suggests there are vast sections of the multiverse Rick has never accessed, realities where he might not be Rick C-137, or might not be a genius, or might not exist at all. These possibilities form the foundation for the show's future, as both Rick and viewers now understand that what we thought was infinite was actually just a carefully controlled subset of a truly infinite multiverse. The scientific theories behind Rick's understanding of reality were accurate but incomplete, limited by his own ego and fear of true cosmic insignificance. Did you know Rick and Morty's timeline mechanics are actually based on real quantum physics theories? The show doesn't just use scientific terms as window dressing. It incorporates legitimate concepts from theoretical physics as the foundation for its multiverse adventures. When Rick explains to Morty how infinite timelines work in Rick Potion number 9, he's essentially describing the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, a real scientific theory proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957. This theory suggests that every possible outcome of every quantum measurement occurs in a separate world or universe, creating an infinite branching of reality with each decision point. The writers consistently use the many worlds interpretation throughout the series, showing different timelines, where small changes lead to completely different outcomes. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, we see this concept brought to life as the Citadel of Ricks. Houses versions of Rick from countless dimensions, each slightly different based on the choices made in their timeline. Some have different hair, some use different technology, but all represent branches of the same quantum possibility tree. This isn't just creative storytelling. It's a visualization of actual quantum theory that physicists debate today. What makes Rick and Morty unique is how it balances scientifically plausible elements with completely fantastical concepts. While the basic idea of multiple timelines stems from legitimate physics, the show adds creative elements like the ability to travel between these timelines using portal technology. Real quantum mechanics doesn't suggest we can physically move between parallel worlds, but the show uses this scientific foundation to create its own internally consistent rules. This blend creates a universe that feels scientifically grounded while still allowing for creative freedom. The writers prove particularly skilled at using scientific terminology accurately while making it accessible. When Rick explains concepts like quantum superposition, he usually does it through demonstration rather than lecture. In A Wrinkle in Time, Rick accidentally splits time into multiple uncertain possibilities, creating overlapping timelines that visually represent the concept of quantum uncertainty. Rather than explaining Heisenberg's uncertainty principle directly, the episode shows multiple Ricks and Mortys existing in quantum superposition until they're observed and reality collapses into a single timeline. This approach makes complex physics concepts digestible without simplifying them beyond recognition. The explanations of multiverse mechanics evolve throughout the seasons, becoming more complex as both the audience and Morty gain understanding. In Season 1, Rick's explanation in the garage uses a simple diagram showing branching timeline pathways. By Season 3, in The Rickshank Redemption, Rick casually references concepts like quantum entanglement and dimensional drift without explanation, assuming viewers now understand the basics. This progression mirrors how scientific understanding builds upon itself, with each concept supporting more complex ideas as knowledge increases. The animation style changes noticeably when depicting quantum concepts, using visual cues to help viewers grasp these abstract ideas. When dealing with uncertain timelines or quantum probabilities, the animation often employs split screens, overlapping images, or blurred boundaries between characters. In A Wrinkle in Time, the quantum uncertainty is visualized through a split-screen effect showing slightly different versions of events happening simultaneously, with the splits multiplying as uncertainty increases. The color palette in these sequences shifts toward blues and greens, creating a visual language that signals to viewers when quantum concepts are in play. Despite the seemingly chaotic narrative that jumps between dimensions and timelines, the show maintains surprisingly consistent rules about how its multiverse works. The writers established early that each timeline continues to exist after Rick and Morty leave it, as evidenced by the abandoned Croninberg world that appears in later episodes. They also established that there are replacement dimensions nearly identical to the original, but with small differences. These rules remain consistent throughout the series, creating a framework that allows for wild adventures while maintaining narrative coherence. Real quantum physics concepts appear throughout the timeline stories, often serving as both plot devices and thematic elements. Quantum entanglement, the phenomenon where particles become connected so that the quantum state of each particle cannot be described independently, appears when Rick links objects across dimensions. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle informs episodes where attempting to measure or observe a situation changes its outcome. Even the concept of quantum decoherence, where quantum systems interact with their environment and lose their quantum properties, appears when uncertain timelines collapse into single realities. The episode Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Repeat offers a perfect example of quantum mechanics in storytelling. When Morty keeps bringing Rick back from the dead using death crystals, each resurrection creates a different quantum outcome based on probability. This directly references the quantum concept that particles exist in all possible states until observed or measured. The episode visualizes this by showing multiple potential futures flowing from each decision point, with more probable outcomes appearing brighter and clearer than less likely ones. A creative representation of quantum probability waves. The concept of observer effect from quantum physics appears repeatedly throughout the series. In quantum mechanics, the act of measurement affects the phenomenon being observed, collapsing wave functions into definite states. The show translates this into narrative form through episodes like Morty's Mind Blowers, where Rick removes memories that would change how Morty observes and interacts with reality. By controlling what Morty remembers, Rick essentially manipulates which quantum state of reality Morty experiences, directly mirroring how observation affects quantum outcomes in real physics. Rick and Morty primarily draws from three scientific theories for its timeline concepts: the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and superstring theory. The many worlds theory provides the foundation for the infinite timelines where all possibilities exist simultaneously. The Copenhagen interpretation, which suggests quantum systems exist in all possible states until observed, informs episodes dealing with probability and uncertainty. And elements of superstring theory, particularly the concept of brains or membrane-like structures separating dimensions, appear in how the show visualizes boundaries between realities. What makes these scientific concepts work so well in the show is how they're translated visually through animation. Concepts that would require pages of mathematical equations become instantly understandable through visual metaphors. When Rick freezes time in A Wrinkle in Time, the fractured, overlapping animation shows quantum uncertainty better than any verbal explanation could. When portals between dimensions appear, their swirling green energy represents the theoretical barriers between branching timelines that string theory proposes. Animation becomes the perfect medium for making these abstract physics concepts tangible. In Rest and Ricklaxation, Rick and Morty visit a cosmic spa that removes the negative aspects of their personalities. This seemingly fantastical concept actually draws from the quantum phenomenon of wave function collapse, where multiple potential states resolve into a single reality. The separated aspects of their personalities represent different quantum states that would normally exist simultaneously in superposition until forced to resolve. Even the method of recombining their split selves uses a detector that works on principles similar to how quantum particles are observed and measured in physics experiments. The scientific foundation of Rick and Morty's timelines creates emotional impact by giving cosmic weight to personal choices. When Rick discusses probability in 60 Minutes, showing infinite channels of television from infinite realities, he explains to Morty that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV. This nihilistic statement directly stems from the implications of quantum multiverse theory. In a reality where every possibility exists, individual choices might seem meaningless. But the show repeatedly demonstrates that, despite the cosmic insignificance suggested by quantum physics, the connections between characters remain meaningful within their subjective experience. What happens when infinite versions of the smartest man in the universe try to form a government? The Citadel of Ricks stands as one of the most fascinating locations in the entire series, functioning as a central hub that connects thousands of timelines. First introduced in Season 1's Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the Citadel represents something our Rick despises yet paradoxically helped create: a bureaucratic structure designed to organize and govern countless versions of himself. The Citadel exists in a pocket dimension that serves as a meeting point for Ricks and Mortys from across the central finite curve, essentially creating a society entirely populated by alternate versions of just two people. The irony of the Citadel's existence can't be overstated. Throughout the series, Rick C-137 consistently expresses his hatred for government, structure, and authority in any form. He actively rebels against the Galactic Federation, dismisses the rules of every planet he visits, and regularly mocks bureaucracy as a concept. Yet the Citadel represents the ultimate form of self-governance, a massive bureaucratic machine created by Ricks to control other Ricks. This contradiction reveals something fundamental about Rick's character. His problems with authority aren't philosophical but personal. He doesn't hate government itself. He hates anyone having authority over him specifically. The visual design of the Citadel tells us a lot about how Ricks view themselves and their place in the multiverse. The architecture combines sleek, futuristic elements with classical government buildings, creating a space that feels simultaneously advanced and traditional. We see massive domes reminiscent of Capitol buildings, but constructed with impossible geometric patterns that suggest advanced understanding of spatial dimensions. The central structures feature towering spires that reach upward, physically representing the Ricks' view of themselves as superior beings. Even the layout of the city imposes order on chaos. Grid-like patterns with clear zones for different functions, all organized around the central council chambers where the most Ricks make decisions for everyone else. In the episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, also known as Tales from the Citadel, we get our most comprehensive look at this society, revealing the true scope of timeline manipulation happening behind the scenes. The Citadel isn't just a meeting place, it's an entire economic and political system built around managing the multiverse. We see factories where Mortys are manufactured and assigned to Ricks who've lost their original Mortys. Schools exist where Mortys learn standardized information to make them compatible with any Rick. Most disturbing is the Simple Ricks factory, where a Rick is kept in a perpetual dream state to harvest his happy memories, which are then processed into wafer cookies for other Ricks to consume. A literal commodification of timeline experiences. The sound design of Citadel scenes creates a distinct audio environment that reinforces its nature as a multi-dimensional hub. Background audio in these sequences features dozens of overlapping conversations, all in Rick or Morty voices, but discussing different topics in different tones. This creates an unsettling audio landscape where individual words occasionally become clear before being swallowed back into the general murmur. The music in Citadel scenes often incorporates multiple melodic lines playing simultaneously, creating auditory density that mirrors the compressed nature of countless realities existing in one space. Even the sound of portal guns becomes a regular background element, creating a constant whooshing ambient noise as Ricks arrive and depart from various timelines. The Citadel maintains extensive systems for monitoring and categorizing different realities across the multiverse. In the Ricklantis Mix-Up, we see the Citadel's version of a police force that tracks unauthorized dimension hopping and timeline interference. Control rooms exist with massive screens showing real-time data from countless realities, with Ricks and Mortys assigned to monitor for anomalies. The episode Never Ricking Morty further reveals that the Citadel maintains an interdimensional cable news network that reports on events across the multiverse, implying constant surveillance of multiple timelines. Most significantly, in The Rickshank Redemption, we learn the Citadel has the technology to instantly identify which reality a particular Rick comes from, suggesting a comprehensive classification system for the entire multiverse. The most disturbing aspect of the Citadel's management system appears in Tales from the Citadel, when we see the Morty Market, a place where Ricks can purchase replacement Mortys when their original ones die. This reveals that the Citadel views Mortys as interchangeable resources rather than individuals, and maintains systems to ensure their continued supply. The episode shows Mortis being processed through an assignment center where they're matched with Ricks based on compatibility metrics, essentially treating living beings as products. This systematic approach to timeline management shows how the Ricks have industrialized the very concept of alternate realities. The Citadel represents the show's most complex exploration of identity. When everyone is a Rick or a Morty, what makes any particular Rick or Morty special? This question haunts the entire Citadel society, creating a rigid class system where Ricks, who appear more like the ideal Rick, receive better treatment and opportunities. Mortis exist primarily as accessories to Ricks, with some rebellious Mortis attempting to create their own identities apart from their designated roles. The episode Tales from the Citadel follows several different Ricks and Mortys, showing how even with identical starting points, different experiences create unique individuals. Some Ricks become cops, others factory workers, others politicians, suggesting that while genetics might be consistent across timelines, experiences ultimately define identity. This crisis of identity appears most clearly in the Citadel's Rick population. Since each Rick believes himself to be the smartest being in his universe, bringing thousands of Ricks together creates an immediate hierarchy problem. If every Rick is a genius, then being a genius no longer makes any individual Rick special. This drives many Citadel Ricks to find other ways to distinguish themselves, through political power, economic success, or even becoming more Rick than other Ricks by embracing the stereotypical traits associated with Rick, C137. The internal conflicts of the Citadel stem directly from this identity crisis, a society of egomaniacs all competing to prove their uniqueness in a population of themselves. Records kept by the Citadel reveal the full extent of Rick's timeline destruction throughout the series. While the show directly shows Rick abandoning or destroying about 5 timelines on screen, the Citadel's databases contain records of C-137 being responsible for disrupting or abandoning at least 37 different realities. This number appears briefly on a screen in The Rickshank Redemption, when Rick's profile is pulled up by the Council. These records show that the Croninberg incident wasn't an isolated occurrence but part of a pattern of timeline abandonment that Rick has engaged in throughout his travels. The Citadel categorizes C-137 as having an unusually high rate of reality destruction, even by Rick standards, which contributes to his reputation as the Rickest. Rick, both admired and feared by other Ricks for his willingness to discard entire realities. The bureaucratic structure of the Citadel ultimately proves to be its undoing. When Evil Morty rises to power, he exploits the very systems the Ricks created to control the multiverse. The elaborate monitoring networks, reality classification systems, and centralized authority structure give Evil Morty the tools he needs to execute his plan to break free from the central finite curve. As we see him ascend to the presidency of the Citadel in Tales from the Citadel, we understand that the Ricks' attempt to impose order on infinite chaos has created the perfect conditions for their own destruction. The systems designed to protect them from outside threats become weapons turned against them from within, showing the fundamental flaw in trying to bureaucratize infinity. What if the most dangerous entity in the multiverse isn't Rick, but a Morty who learned to think like him? Evil Morty first appears in Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, though we don't know his name at this point. He's simply the Morty controlling the Rick who's been murdering Ricks across the multiverse. The episode ends with the reveal that this Morty has been the mastermind all along, removing his eye patch to show a cybernetic device he used to control his Rick. As the camera focuses on his expressionless face, the music shifts to For the Damaged Coda by Blonde Redhead, a song that would become permanently associated with this character throughout the series. What makes Evil Morty unique is that he understands timeline manipulation at the same level as Rick, but with entirely different motivations. While Rick uses his knowledge to avoid consequences and maintain his freedom, Evil Morty systematically accumulates power with a specific goal: breaking free from the central finite curve. This plan represents the most significant timeline disruption in the entire series, as it doesn't just affect one reality, but potentially the entire structure of the multiverse. By breaking through the barrier that separates realities where Rick is the smartest being from the rest of the multiverse, Evil Morty essentially tears apart the fundamental structure that the entire show has been built upon. The animation team uses subtle visual cues to distinguish Evil Morty from standard Mortys. His expressions are more controlled and minimal, with fewer of the exaggerated emotional reactions typical of other Mortys. His movements are precise and deliberate rather than nervous or jerky. The most distinctive visual element is his eye. First covered by the eye patch, and later, after his identity is known, animated with a slightly colder stare than other Mortys. During his campaign for president of the Citadel, he's shown in cleaner, crisper animation with sharper lines than the other candidates, subtly indicating his exceptional status among Mortys without explicitly stating it. Color choices around Evil Morty create a distinct visual language. While standard Morty scenes feature the show's typical bright color palette, Evil Morty sequences often shift toward cooler tones, more blues and grays, with lighting that creates stronger shadows on his face. This color distinction becomes most pronounced in Tales from the Citadel, when he's elected president. The final sequence shows him walking through the Citadel's corridors as the lights shift from standard illumination to a colder blue, visually representing his takeover of the system. His yellow shirt, identical to all other Mortys, stands out more dramatically against these cooler backgrounds, a visual reminder that he is still a Morty despite his different behavior. The music that accompanies Evil Morty's scenes has become one of the most recognizable elements of the character. For the damaged coda plays during each of his major reveals, creating immediate tension for viewers who recognize the theme. The song itself is haunting and melancholic, with a simple piano melody that contrasts sharply with the show's usually energetic synthesizer score. This musical choice is particularly effective because it's used sparingly, appearing only when Evil Morty's true nature is revealed or when he achieves a significant victory. In Tales from the Citadel, the song doesn't play until the final moments when his true identity is revealed, making the musical cue an effective signal to viewers that something momentous has occurred. Evil Morty's storyline develops across multiple seasons through subtle hints placed in seemingly unrelated episodes. After his initial appearance in Season 1, he isn't directly shown again until Season 3's Tales from the Citadel, though his influence is suggested in several episodes between. The episode Morty Night Run introduces the concept of Ricks abandoning their Mortys at a daycare center, potentially providing background for how a Morty might become independent. In The Rick Shank Redemption, we learn about the Council of Rick's extensive records on Rick C-137, information Evil Morty likely accessed before making his move for power. These subtle connections create a sense that Evil Morty's plan has been developing in the background of the entire series, even when he's not on screen. What makes Evil Morty such a compelling villain is that he represents the ultimate consequence of Rick's timeline manipulation. He's essentially created a being capable of challenging the entire system. By exposing countless Mortys to the reality of the multiverse, teaching them about timeline manipulation, and then treating them as disposable, the Ricks inadvertently created the conditions for a Morty to understand their methods well enough to exploit them. Evil Morty isn't just rebelling against Rick, he's using Rick's own multiverse knowledge against him. This makes him fundamentally different from other antagonists in the series, who typically oppose Rick because they don't understand his methods or power. Evil Morty opposes Rick precisely because he understands everything. Evidence of Evil Morty's methodical corruption of established timelines appears throughout his storyline. The tortured Mortys in his hidden base from close Rick counters of the Rick kind suggest he's been experimenting with Morty brainwaves across different timelines. His calculated rise through Citadel politics shows long-term planning and manipulation of the system. Most significantly, his final plan in the Season 5 finale reveals he's been gathering the necessary components and knowledge to break through the central finite curve for years, carefully positioning himself where he could access the Citadel's central systems. Each step shows not just intelligence but patience, the ability to work within corrupted timelines long enough to understand how to break free from them entirely. While Rick and Morty both experience timeline trauma throughout the series, Evil Morty faces the most severe timeline shifts by far. His entire existence is defined by timeline trauma, not just experiencing it, but understanding it at a fundamental level. Unlike the main Morty, who processes timeline shifts emotionally, or Rick, who has the capacity to ignore or suppress his reactions, Evil Morty's identity is formed entirely in response to the timeline manipulation he's experienced. We don't know his original timeline or what specific events transformed him, but the results are clear. He developed a complete understanding of how timelines work and a determination to escape the limited subset Rick created. What distinguishes Evil Morty's timeline trauma from other characters is that he experiences it consciously and uses it constructively toward his goal. When Rick abandons a timeline, he simply moves on without processing the experience. When Morty faces timeline shifts, he suffers psychological damage but eventually adapts. Evil Morty, however, appears to have analyzed each timeline experience methodically, learning from it rather than being traumatized by it. This analytical approach to timeline trauma makes him uniquely dangerous. He's not just a victim of the system, but someone who has mastered it through experiencing its worst effects. In the Season 5 finale, Evil Morty finally achieves his goal of breaking through the central finite curve, traveling beyond the walled-off section of the multiverse that Rick created. This moment represents the culmination of a character arc spanning multiple seasons, from controlled pawn to president to truly free entity. As he travels through the golden portal into the unknown parts of the multiverse, we witness the completion of the most extensive timeline journey in the series. The seemingly minor timeline split that created Evil Morty ultimately led to consequences affecting the entire multiverse structure, perfectly demonstrating how small divergences can create massive, unpredictable outcomes across reality itself. How does a single decision by Morty to use a love potion lead to the destruction of multiple universes? This question gets at the core of what makes Rick and Morty's approach to timelines so fascinating. Tiny decisions routinely cascade into reality-breaking catastrophes. The butterfly effect concept from chaos theory perfectly describes how the show handles timeline divergence. The theory suggests that small changes in initial conditions can create huge differences in outcomes, just like a butterfly flapping its wings might eventually cause a tornado thousands of miles away. The clearest example starts with Morty simply asking Rick for a love potion to use on his crush Jessica. This seemingly innocent request sets off a chain reaction that destroys an entire reality. Rick creates the potion using vole DNA, Jessica spreads it through flu transmission, and eventually a series of failed fixes turns everyone except the Smith family into Croninberg monsters. This wasn't some elaborate scheme, just a teenager with a crush and a grandfather willing to help in the laziest possible way. The writers consistently show how these small choices create massive divergences, reinforcing the idea that, in an infinite multiverse, catastrophic outcomes are always just one bad decision away. The contrast between episodes with minor timeline splits and those with universe ending consequences highlights the unpredictable nature of chaos. In interdimensional cable, flipping between dimensions has virtually no consequence, it's just entertainment. But in Rick Potion number 9, a similar seemingly minor action, creating a simple potion, ruins an entire world. There's no way to predict which small action will remain insignificant and which will snowball into disaster. We see this again in Morty's Mind Blowers, when Morty simply moves a snake a few feet to help it, accidentally causing the extinction of an entire alien civilization. These juxtapositions show how the multiverse operates on principles of chaos rather than order. Minor variables can grow exponentially until they reshape entire realities. Several key moments throughout the series show characters making decisions they don't realize are timeline critical until it's too late. When Morty insists on saving Fart the Gaseous being in Morty Night Run, he doesn't understand he's preventing the destruction of all carbon-based life. When Summer turns the tiny device in Rixie business that freezes time, she has no idea they'll end up trapped in frozen time for 6 months. Rick's decision to bring home Mr. Poopy Butthole without checking his background leads to the alien parasite infestation in Total Recall. In each case, the characters couldn't possibly know the consequences of their actions, yet these moments become critical timeline junction points where reality itself hangs in the balance. The animation team uses specific techniques to visualize these branching timelines and make the abstract concept of diverging realities visible to viewers. In A Wrinkle in Time, they use a split-screen approach that multiplies as uncertainty increases, eventually showing dozens of slightly different versions of events happening simultaneously. When Rick repairs the timeline, these panels merge back together, visually representing timeline convergence. In Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Repeat, we see multiple possible futures flowing outward from Morty's decisions, with more probable outcomes appearing brighter and more solid than less likely ones. These visual cues help viewers understand which moments represent significant branch points in the timeline without requiring explicit explanation. Sound design plays a crucial role in signaling timeline split points throughout the series. When a significant branch occurs, the audio often includes a distinctive whoosh or rumble that signals reality shifting. In Rick Potion number 9, as the world transforms into Croninberg monsters, the background music distorts and warps, mirroring the genetic manipulation happening to the population. Assistant Timeline jumps through portal gun use, have their own unique sound signature, a wet slurping sound followed by electronic humming. These audio cues create a consistent language that helps viewers recognize when timeline-altering events are occurring, even before the visual consequences become apparent. The writers use this chaos theory concept to explore deeper philosophical questions about free will versus determinism. If every possible choice creates a new timeline, does free will truly exist, or are all possible choices predetermined across the multiverse? Rick seems to believe the latter, adopting a nihilistic view that nothing matters precisely because every possible outcome exists somewhere. In Ricksty Minutes, he tells Morty, "Nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV." This perspective comes directly from his understanding of timeline mechanics. In a multiverse where every possibility exists, individual choices lose meaning. But the show repeatedly challenges this view by showing how specific choices still matter enormously to the characters making them, even if alternate versions exist elsewhere. Some seemingly unimportant objects become crucial timeline nexus points throughout the series. The green glowing rocks in Get Swifty initially appear as just alien meteorites, but actually contain the Cromulons who threaten to destroy Earth. The simple love potion in Rick Potion No. 9 looks like an ordinary flask of liquid but causes worldwide genetic mutation. Most significantly, the portal gun itself, an object Rick treats casually, represents the most important timeline-affecting technology in the show. These objects function as physical manifestations of chaos theories, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, where small inputs can dramatically affect entire systems. Among all the timeline catastrophes in the series, which one had the biggest emotional impact on the main characters? While the Croninberg incident stands out for being the first major abandonment, the true answer isn't any single timeline disaster, but the accumulated psychological weight of all abandoned realities. This becomes evident in Season 3's Morty's Mindblowers, where we discover Rick has been erasing Morty's most traumatic memories, many relating to timeline disasters. When Morty accidentally sees the full scope of abandoned and destroyed realities he's been part of, he attempts suicide rather than continue living with the knowledge. This reveals that the emotional impact of these timeline jumps doesn't diminish with repetition. It compounds until it becomes nearly unbearable. We see evidence of this accumulated trauma in both characters. Rick's alcoholism worsens as the series progresses, suggesting he's self-medicating against the weight of knowing how many realities he's destroyed or abandoned. Morty develops increasing signs of PTSD, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and occasional flashbacks to previous timeline disasters. Summer, who joins their adventures later, shows a faster psychological adaptation to timeline shifts, but still expresses existential dread when learning about replacement realities. Even Beth, who rarely participates in interdimensional travel, questions her own identity after learning about the possibility of clone replacements. The butterfly effect in Rick and Morty serves as both narrative device and philosophical framework. By showing how small choices create massive divergences, the show challenges viewers to consider the potential consequences of their own seemingly minor decisions. It suggests that in a universe governed by chaos, theory principles, attempting to control outcomes is ultimately futile. Yet the choices we make still define who we are, even if alternate versions of ourselves made different choices elsewhere. This tension between cosmic insignificance and personal meaning creates the core philosophical struggle that both Rick and Morty navigate throughout their multiverse adventures. How do you keep track of which Rick and Morty you're watching when there are infinite versions across countless timelines? With an endless number of realities and character variants, the show creators had to develop a system of visual markers that help viewers understand which timeline they're watching at any given moment. These visual cues range from obvious character differences to subtle environmental changes that most viewers might not consciously notice, but that their brains register as signals of timeline shifts. The challenge of maintaining narrative coherence across a show with potentially infinite versions of the same characters is enormous. Without clear visual identifiers, viewers would quickly become lost in the multiverse, unable to tell which Rick and Morty they're following or which timeline they're in. The writers and animators solved this problem by creating a consistent visual language that signals timeline changes without requiring explicit explanation in the dialogue. These visual markers function as a kind of shorthand that allows the show to move quickly between realities without confusing the audience. Character appearance variations serve as the most immediate and noticeable timeline markers. After the events of Rick Potion Number 9, Rick C-137 has a specific look that distinguishes him from other Ricks. His wild bluish-gray hair stands slightly taller than most other Ricks, and he has a small drool mark at the corner of his mouth that appears more consistently than on alternate Ricks. We see this clearly in Citadel episodes, where our Rick stands out visually from the crowd. Similarly, our Morty has slightly more expressive eyes than most alternate Mortys, who tend to have a more uniform, simplified expression. These subtle differences help viewers instantly identify the main characters, even in scenes filled with variants. Clothing variations also provide important timeline clues. In close Rick counters of the Rick kind, we see dozens of Rick variants with different clothing styles. Ricks with hats, Ricks in suits, Ricks with different colored shirts. While C-137, Rick consistently wears his signature lab coat, subtle variations like stains or tears can indicate timeline shifts. When Rick temporarily moves to a tiny version of Earth in the Rickshank Redemption, his outfit briefly changes to include a tiny hat. These costume changes, however slight, help viewers track which version of the character they're watching. Environmental details throughout the show serve as critical timeline anchors. The most famous example is the cracked driveway at the Smith house that appears after Rick and Morty move to a replacement dimension in Rick Potion Number 9. This crack remains consistent in all future episodes, serving as confirmation that we're still following the same timeline. In Morty's Mind Blowers, we see an alternate timeline where the driveway isn't cracked, immediately signaling to attentive viewers that we're seeing a different reality. Other household details like changed furniture positions, different wall decorations, or altered room layouts serve similar functions. The animation style itself subtly shifts between different reality versions. Dimensions closer to the main timeline maintain the show's standard animation style, while more divergent realities feature noticeable differences in color saturation, line quality, or character proportions. The Croninberg dimension has a darker, more saturated color palette, with rougher line work that reflects its monstrous inhabitants. The hamster and butt world from Rick and Morty's whirly-dirly conspiracy uses softer lines and more pastel colors, creating a visual language that immediately signals different reality to viewers. Even tiny adjustments in how light sources are animated can help. Distinguish similar but different timelines. Background details often contain some of the most important timeline markers. In the Smith family house, family photos change subtly between different timelines. Pictures on the refrigerator, items on shelves, and even the specific books on bookshelves can differ between realities. In Rest and Ricklaxation, the toxic versions of Rick and Morty exist in a dimension that features the same locations as the main timeline but with distinctly dirtier, more decayed versions of every object and environment. These consistent visual differences help ground viewers in specific timelines without requiring explicit explanation. The show's creators use these visual markers intentionally, helping viewers track timeline changes without breaking the narrative flow with explanations. When Evil Morty appears in close Rick counters of the Rick kind, his eye patch immediately distinguishes him from other Mortys. When he returns in Tales from the Citadel, the eye patch is gone, but subtle animation differences in his expressions and movements provide continuity clues that this is the same character. The President Morty has more controlled facial expressions and more deliberate movements than typical Mortys, visual cues that hint at his true identity before it's explicitly revealed. Some easily missed visual cues become crucial for understanding timeline continuity later in the series. In early episodes, the Smith family garage has a specific arrangement of items on the workbench. After the dimension switch, these items are arranged slightly differently, a detail so minor that most viewers wouldn't notice it consciously, but that provides subtle reinforcement that this is a different reality. In the Rickshank Redemption, when Rick transfers his consciousness between different bodies, tiny animation details like how he holds his flask or his specific walking pattern remain consistent, helping viewers track Rick across different physical forms. The most comprehensive system of visual timeline markers appears in Citadel episodes, where we see countless Ricks and Mortys differentiated through visual coding. The Citadel uses color-coded uniforms to distinguish between different roles. Blue for police Ricks, orange for worker Ricks, standard white lab coats for scientist Ricks. These visual shortcuts allow viewers to immediately understand the social structure of the Citadel without requiring exposition. Similarly, wealthy Ricks wear more elaborate outfits with accessories, while lower-status Ricks have simpler, sometimes damaged clothing, creating a visual class system that communicates complex social information through pure visual design. This extensive system of visual markers creates a sophisticated language for multiverse navigation that allows viewers to track their position across infinite realities. The cracked driveway, Rick's specific hairstyle, Morty's yellow shirt, the arrangement of garage tools. All these elements work together to create a consistent visual identity for the main timeline we follow throughout most episodes. When these markers change, viewers receive immediate visual notification that they're watching a different reality without needing a character to explain it directly. These visual timeline cues demonstrate the incredible attention to detail in the show's production. By maintaining consistency in these markers across multiple seasons and episodes, the creators allow for a complex multiverse narrative that would otherwise be impossible to follow. As we listen to the distinctive musical themes that accompany different timeline variants, we begin to see how the visual language of Rick and Morty's multiverse works in concert with its audio design to create a complete sensory experience of timeline navigation. Did you notice how the music completely transforms when Rick and Morty enter a new timeline? The soundtrack isn't just background noise, it's actually a sophisticated system that helps viewers navigate the multiverse. The composers Ryan Elder and other musicians who work on the show create distinct audio environments for different dimensions, essentially giving each timeline its own musical identity. This audio design works together with the visual markers to create a complete sensory experience that tells your brain which reality you're watching even before any character explains it. The show's soundtrack creates atmospheric signatures for different timelines that become recognizable across episodes. The most famous example is Evil Morty's theme, For the Damaged Coda, by Blonde Redhead, which plays during his first appearance at the end of Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, and returns whenever he makes a significant move. This haunting piano melody has become so strongly associated with this character that just a few notes immediately signal his presence to viewers. Similarly, the Citadel has its own musical identity. A blend of bureaucratic elevator-style music mixed with sci-fi elements that perfectly captures its nature as a sterile government facility filled with mad scientists. In many episodes, the music actually starts changing before any visual cues appear, foreshadowing timeline distortions that haven't happened yet. In Rick Potion number 9, the background music begins incorporating subtle distortions and discordant notes while the world still looks normal. As the Croninberg transformation progresses, these audio distortions increase until the music becomes as twisted as the reality it accompanies. This technique prepares viewers subconsciously for the coming reality shift, creating a sense of unease before anything visually disturbing appears on screen. The audio essentially warns viewers that something is wrong with this timeline before they can see it. Each major timeline or reality state within the show has its own musical theme that functions almost like a leitmotif in classical music. The Cronenberg world features distorted versions of previously established themes, with warped synthesizer notes and uneven rhythms that mirror the genetic chaos of that dimension. The Citadel of Ricks uses bureaucratic, almost elevator music-style themes with occasional science fiction flourishes, establishing its sterile governmental nature. The microverse inside Rick's battery in The Ricks Must Be Crazy has a distinct tribal electronic fusion soundtrack that establishes it as both primitive and artificially created. These consistent musical identities help viewers instantly recognize which reality they're experiencing. Sound effects also change subtly between dimensions, creating auditory continuity for specific timeline branches. Portal sounds vary slightly depending on which dimension is being accessed. Portals to the Citadel have a slightly higher pitched whoosh than portals to random dimensions. In Morty Night Run, the Jerry Borey Daycare Center has a specific ambient sound profile with gentle music and muted conversation that distinguishes it from other locations. Even the sound of Rick's spaceship changes slightly in different timelines, with the main timeline ship having a distinctive rattle that replacement ships don't share. These consistent audio details help ground viewers in specific realities. The voice actors adjust their performances between timeline variants, creating subtle differences for alternate versions of characters. Justin Roiland, who voices both Rick and Morty, creates slightly different vocal patterns for alternate timeline versions. Citadel Ricks typically speak with less burping and more formal diction than C-137 Rick. Simple Rick from the Ricklantis Mix-Up has a gentler, more stable voice without the usual gravel. Morty variants also receive unique vocal treatments. Evil Morty speaks with fewer vocal cracks and more controlled pacing, while worker Mortys at the Citadel have more pronounced stammer patterns. These performance choices create audio identifiers that help distinguish character variants. The composers use recurring musical motifs to connect related timelines or signal returns to previously visited realities. Whenever the show returns to the Croninberg world, it reintroduces the distorted audio elements from the original episode, creating continuity across seasons. When characters return to the Citadel in different episodes, similar bureaucratic musical themes reappear, though they evolve slightly to reflect changes in the Citadel's political situation. These musical callbacks function as audio breadcrumbs that help viewers place current events in relation to previous timeline experiences. Each return to a familiar dimension brings back its established musical identity, often with subtle variations that indicate how that reality has changed since the last visit. Background ambient sounds create distinct audio environments for different timeline locations, forming an essential part of the show's reality marking system. Earth dimensions have recognizable urban sounds, car horns, distant voices, household appliances, while alien planets feature unique ambient elements like unusual wildlife calls or strange wind patterns. The microverse inside Rick's battery has its own environmental soundscape with tiny electronic hums that establish its artificial nature. During the interdimensional cable episodes, each channel has its own distinct audio production quality and background noise profile, helping sell the idea that they're coming from completely different realities with different broadcasting technology. The audio quality itself changes between timelines, creating another layer of reality differentiation. The main timeline maintains the show's standard audio mix, with clear dialogue, balanced music, and precise sound effects. When Rick and Morty visit more chaotic or dangerous dimensions, the overall audio becomes more compressed, with harsher transitions between sounds and more extreme dynamic range. Dimensions like the Purge planet in Look Who's Purging Now feature more aggressive audio, mixing with sharper sound effect cuts and less subtle musical transitions. These production quality differences create a subconscious audio indicator of how far a particular reality is from the main timeline. Through these techniques, the show's music changes across different timelines, essentially creating an audio roadmap through the multiverse. The music doesn't just complement the visuals, it actively participates in telling viewers where they are in the vast multiverse. When viewed across multiple episodes, these audio markers form a sophisticated system that helps maintain narrative coherence despite the potentially confusing nature of multiple realities. The soundtrack functions as an emotional guide, helping viewers process the complex philosophical implications of timeline hopping by giving each reality its own distinct emotional tone. This audio roadmap becomes particularly evident when watching timeline-focused episodes back-to-back. The transition from the relative audio normalcy of early episodes to the increasingly complex soundscapes of later seasons reflects the expanding multiverse concept. Early episodes like Rick Potion No. 9 use simpler audio differentiation techniques, primarily focusing on distortion to indicate reality breakdown. Later episodes like the Ricklantis Mix-Up employ much more sophisticated audio layering, with multiple timeline-specific themes playing simultaneously as the episode jumps between different stories within the Citadel. This evolution shows how the audio design grows more complex as the show explores more complex multiverse concepts. When we put together all these timeline episodes in sequence, the musical progression creates a surprisingly coherent emotional narrative. We start with the relatively simple reality breakdown of Rick Potion number 9, progress through the bureaucratic complexity of Citadel episodes, and eventually reach the reality-shattering conclusion of Evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve. Each step in this journey has its own distinct musical identity, yet they connect through recurring motifs and evolving themes. The soundtrack doesn't just accompany this journey. It actively helps tell the story of how Rick's multiverse works and how our characters navigate its infinite possibilities. Through music, sound design, and voice performance, the show creates an audio experience that makes the abstract concept of multiple timelines emotionally comprehensible. What hidden patterns emerge when we view all of Rick and Morty's twisted timelines back to back? When you watch these episodes in sequence rather than spread across seasons, a surprisingly coherent meta-narrative appears. The seemingly random timeline adventures actually form a structured story about how people cope with infinite possibilities. It's like looking at individual puzzle pieces versus seeing the completed picture. Suddenly, the chaotic elements align into something meaningful. The timeline episodes create a philosophical progression that builds from simple concepts to complex existential questions. We start with the basic idea of alternate dimensions in Rick Potion number 9, where the concept is primarily used for plot purposes. Rick messes up a world, so they move to another one. By the Rickshank Redemption, the multiverse concept has evolved into questions about identity itself. If infinite versions of you exist, which one is really you? And finally, in Season 5, the central finite curve revelation transforms everything into a story about artificial limitations and breaking beyond them. This progression isn't accidental. The writers are building a coherent argument about existence across seemingly unrelated episodes. Recurring visual motifs connect these timeline stories even when they're separated by multiple seasons. Green portal fluid appears consistently as a visual marker of timeline transition, but its presentation evolves. In early episodes, portals appear clean and perfect. As the series progresses, we see more unstable portals with flickering edges or irregular shapes, visually representing how the character's understanding of timeline stability changes. The image of characters facing their alternate selves also repeats throughout timeline episodes, but with different emotional contexts. From horror in early episodes to casual acceptance later on. The Smith family home appears across countless realities, but with subtle differences that reward attentive viewers. Family photos change, wall cracks appear in different places, furniture arrangements shift. Character development progresses significantly through these timeline experiences, especially for Morty. In Rick Potion number 9, Morty is traumatized by burying his own body and taking over an alternate life. By Morty Night Run, he's comfortable enough with multiverse concepts to understand complex timeline consequences. And by the Ricklantis Mix-Up, he can explain aspects of multiverse theory to others. This progression isn't just knowledge, it's emotional growth. Early Morty reacts with horror to timeline shifts, while later Morty accepts them as part of life, showing how repeated exposure to something initially traumatic can eventually become normalized. Rick's character actually moves in the opposite direction, starting with casual acceptance of timeline jumping, but gradually showing more awareness of its emotional toll. The writers plant seeds in early timeline episodes that don't fully bloom until seasons later. The Council of Ricks first appears briefly in Season 1, but becomes a major setting in later seasons. Rick's casual mention of the central finite curve in Season 1 becomes a crucial concept by Season 5. These aren't retcons but planned story elements. The writers created these timeline concepts early, then developed them gradually across multiple episodes, rewarding viewers who pay attention across seasons. When Rick tells Morty in Season 1 that they can only perform a reality swap a few times, it sets up limitations that eventually become plot relevant when Rick has exhausted most of his options. The show's humor evolves significantly when dealing with timeline concepts. Early multiverse jokes focus on simple absurdity, weird versions of characters, or strange alternate worlds played for immediate laughs. As the series progresses, the humor becomes more complex, dealing with existential topics like identity and meaning. In Season 1's Rick's Minutes, the joke is simply that TV shows from other dimensions are bizarre. By Season 3's Morty's Mind Blowers, the humor comes from the philosophical implications of memory and identity, Morty literally losing himself as his memories are removed. This evolution shows not just changing comedy styles, but increasing trust in the audience's ability to understand complex multiverse concepts. Evidence of intentional narrative patterns appears when we examine how the timeline episodes handle similar situations. 3 separate episodes feature Rick and Morty facing their own corpses or replacements, but each time with different framing. In Rick Potion number 9, it's presented as horrifying. In Morty's Mind Blowers, it's revealed to have happened multiple times. And in Rick and Morty's Excellent Adventure, it's treated almost casually. This progression shows how the character's relationship with death and identity changes through repeated exposure to timeline anomalies. Similarly, the concept of identity itself transforms across episodes from something fixed to something fluid, as characters repeatedly switch bodies, timelines, and realities. The timeline episodes also tell a story about control versus freedom. Early episodes establish Rick's apparent control over timeline jumping. Middle episodes reveal the limitations of this control and the rules that govern it. Later episodes show attempts to break free from these limitations, culminating in Evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve. This progression creates a narrative about the tension between freedom and constraint that spans the entire series. Rick creates systems to control the multiverse, only to find himself trapped by those same systems. It's a story about how attempts to impose order on chaos often backfire. Visual storytelling techniques evolve across timeline episodes as the concepts become more complex. Early portals are simple circles with minimal animation. Later timeline shifts involve elaborate visualization techniques like multiple overlapping screens, timeline branching diagrams, and complex color-coding systems. The animation itself becomes a teaching tool that helps viewers understand increasingly abstract concepts. In A Wrinkle in Time, the split-screen approach helps visualize uncertainty. In Edge of Morty, probability waves show different possible futures. These aren't just style choices, but narrative tools that make complex physics concepts accessible. When all twisted timelines are viewed back-to-back, the pattern that emerges shows Rick and Morty isn't just about random adventures. It's telling a coherent story about how people create meaning in a universe of infinite possibilities. The episodes build from simple multiverse concepts to complex questions about free will, determinism, and the nature of reality itself. What initially appears as episodic chaos actually contains a structured philosophical progression, carefully developed across seasons. The timeline episodes aren't just about science fiction concepts. They're exploring the psychological impact of those concepts on characters we come to know deeply. If we return to the original Cronenberg clip with this complete context, what initially seemed like a shocking twist now appears as the first step in a carefully constructed journey. Rick and Morty burying their own bodies isn't just a dark joke or convenient plot device. It's the beginning of a series-long exploration of identity, reality, and meaning. That moment of Morty staring blankly after replacing himself contains the seed of every philosophical question the show will explore. Through repeated timeline jumps, character development, and increasingly complex multiverse rules, the show builds a comprehensive view of existence that's both bleakly nihilistic and strangely hopeful. By showing characters finding meaning despite cosmic insignificance, Rick and Morty suggest that even in a universe of infinite timelines, individual experiences still matter. The Rick Sanchez we've come to know operates at a baseline of cynicism that seems almost impossible to penetrate. He moves through the multiverse with a flask in hand, intelligence unmatched, and a persistent emotional distance that keeps everyone at arm's length. This Rick C-137 has mastered space travel, immortality, and even interdimensional cable, yet he can't seem to master his own emotions or form genuine connections. His alcoholism isn't just a character quirk. It's a coping mechanism for trauma so deep that the show only reveals it in fragments. We're meant to believe this is just who Rick is, a genius whose brilliance comes packaged with toxicity. But what if Rick C-137 isn't actually the standard version of himself? What if he's actually one of the most damaged Ricks in the multiverse? We need to look at alternative timelines to understand that Rick's personality isn't inevitable. It's a response to specific experiences that shaped him. Across different realities, we find Ricks who process their trauma in dramatically different ways, creating versions of the character that challenge our understanding of who Rick Sanchez really is at his core. The most revealing glimpse of Rick's alternate potential comes from the episode where he transfers his consciousness into a younger clone body, becoming Tiny Rick. At first, this seems like just another sci-fi adventure, but it quickly becomes something more significant. Tiny Rick isn't just physically younger, he's temporarily unburdened by the weight of his memories. Without decades of pain weighing him down, we see a version of Rick who dances, socializes, and even expresses genuine enthusiasm. He connects with teenagers, writes songs, and embodies joy in a way that feels impossible for the Rick we know. This younger Rick shows us something crucial. Rick's cynicism isn't hardwired into his DNA. It's accumulated trauma. The episode takes a dark turn when the older Rick's consciousness starts fighting back through songs that express his pain. "Let me out. What you see is not the same person as me," Tiny Rick sings, in a moment of psychological breakthrough. This suggests Rick's darkness isn't his natural state, but a prison of pain he's built around himself. The fact that he ultimately chooses to return to his older, damaged self speaks volumes about how comfortable he's become in his misery. The Citadel of Ricks provided another crucial example with Simple Rick. This variant lived a life focused on his daughter Beth, finding genuine fulfillment in family connection rather than scientific conquest. The other Ricks literally harvested his brain chemicals because his happiness was so pure and powerful. Simple Rick never abandoned his family, never went on a vengeful quest across dimensions, and found something the other Ricks secretly craved: peace. His contentment was so rare among Ricks that it became a commodity to be exploited by the others who couldn't achieve it themselves. Even our main timeline, Rick occasionally reveals capacity for compassion that contradicts his professed worldview. In the Vindicators episode, he created an elaborate Saw-like challenge while blackout drunk. The final challenge revealed something Rick would never admit while sober: that he believes Morty is the one thing in the universe that gives his life meaning. He disguised this revelation as a joke, but the truth slipped through. Similarly, when he turned himself into the Galactic Federation to protect his family, he showed that beneath all his selfishness lies a capacity for self-sacrifice. Some of the most fascinating Rick variants exist in timelines where he never abandoned Beth in the first place. These Ricks created entirely different family dynamics, where Beth grew up with a father present in her life. Without abandonment trauma shaping her, these Beths developed healthier relationships with themselves and others. The Jerry-Beth relationship formed under completely different circumstances in these timelines. We only get brief glimpses of these family units, but they operate with far less dysfunction than the Smith family we know. These Ricks chose family over revenge, connection over isolation, and their entire lives unfolded differently as a result. A particularly important variant appears in the form of Doofus Rick, who other Ricks mock mercilessly. This Rick has the same intelligence as the others, but none of the cruelty. He forms a genuine friendship with Jerry, showing empathy and kindness that our Rick would find embarrassing. The other Ricks claim he eats his own feces, a claim he denies, but their mockery reveals more about them than him. They can't accept a Rick who doesn't use his intelligence to elevate himself above others. Doofus. Rick proves that Rick's genius doesn't have to come with emotional damage. That's a choice, not an inevitability. The existence of these compassionate Rick variants suggests something profound about our main Rick. His personality isn't the inevitable result of his intelligence. It's the result of specific traumas and the choices he made in response to those traumas. Every Rick starts with the same basic ingredients: extraordinary intelligence, creativity, and problem-solving abilities. But depending on their experiences and choices, these traits express themselves in drastically different ways. Our Rick chose vengeance, isolation, and scientific conquest. Other Ricks chose healing, connection, and acceptance. What makes these compassionate Rick variants truly unexpected isn't just their kindness. It's that they maintained their intellectual brilliance while finding emotional stability. The Rick we follow seems to believe that his pain is the source of his genius, that his suffering fuels his science. These other Ricks disprove this theory. They demonstrate that Rick could process his trauma, form healthy attachments, and still retain the intelligence that makes him Rick Sanchez. His cynicism isn't the price of his genius. It's a wall he built to avoid dealing with his pain. The most unexpected Rick variants across the multiverse aren't those with the most outlandish adventures or the most extreme technological achievements. They're the ones who found peace without sacrificing their intellect. These Ricks integrated their trauma rather than being consumed by it. They accepted their feelings rather than drowning them in alcohol. They formed connections rather than pushing everyone away with insults and manipulation. These variants don't appear often in the show because they're harder to mine for comedy, but their existence poses the most challenging question about Rick. What if his entire worldview is based on a lie he tells himself? These peaceful Ricks show us that Rick's intelligence doesn't require his misery. His genius doesn't demand his loneliness. His science doesn't necessitate his cruelty. These are choices he makes, not inevitable consequences of who he is. The compassionate Rick spectrum across the multiverse doesn't just give us alternative versions of a character. It challenges the core philosophy that our Rick has built his entire identity around. If these other Ricks can find peace without surrendering their brilliance, why can't he? That question haunts Rick C-137 more than any enemy ever could. The Morty we've grown familiar with throughout most episodes starts out pretty much like you'd expect. Nervous, insecure, and constantly seeking validation from the smartest person in the universe. This baseline Morty stutters through adventures, follows Rick's orders despite obvious danger, and generally lacks confidence in his own abilities. He exists primarily as Rick's sidekick, moral compass, and occasional human shield against threats that specifically target Mortys. We see him regularly express frustration with Rick's recklessness, but ultimately return to the same dependent relationship patterns because he craves approval from his grandfather. This version of Morty seems defined by his reactions to Rick rather than by his own independent choices. But across the multiverse, there exists a version of Morty that completely shatters this established character model. Evil Morty first appeared wearing an eye patch, controlling a Rick through a hidden device, and methodically eliminating Ricks across dimensions. This initial appearance gave us just a glimpse of what this Morty variant represented. Not just a bad Morty, but a Morty who had fully awakened qualities that exist within all Mortys, but typically remain dormant. His calculated patience alone signals something fundamentally different about his psychological makeup. While our Morty acts on impulse and emotion, Evil Morty executes long-term strategies spanning years, demonstrating a level of foresight that seems impossible for the Morty we know. What makes Evil Morty truly fascinating isn't just his villainy, but his complete rejection of the dependent relationship that defines most Rick-Morty pairings. He functions entirely independently, with no Rick pulling his strings or determining his course of action. In fact, he systematically manipulates and controls Ricks to achieve his own ends, completely inverting the power dynamic we've come to expect. This independence represents a total break from the codependency that characterizes the main timeline relationship. While our Morty occasionally rebels against Rick, he always gravitates back to that familiar pattern. Evil Morty made a clean break, rejecting not just his Rick, but the entire system that places Ricks at the center of the multiverse. The calculated nature of Evil Morty's plans reveals strategic thinking far beyond what we typically associate with Morty's character. His takeover of the Citadel required numerous complex steps: infiltrating the system, manipulating the election process, systematically eliminating opposition, and consolidating power through institutional control. Each step demonstrates patient planning and psychological insight into how both Ricks and Mortys operate. Instead of the reactive behavior we see from regular Morty, Evil Morty shows a proactive approach to achieving his goals. He doesn't just respond to situations, he creates them, shapes them, and exploits them for his own benefit. This level of manipulation suggests intelligence that rivals or even exceeds Rick's own strategic abilities. Perhaps most disturbing about Evil Morty is his willingness to sacrifice countless other Mortys to achieve his goals. During his rise to power, and especially during his escape from the central finite curve, he displays complete indifference to the suffering of his alternate selves. In one particularly disturbing scene, we see a room filled with tortured Mortys, their pain powering a cloaking device. This callous disregard for beings that are essentially versions of himself shows how far this Morty has traveled from the empathy that often defines our main timeline Morty. It suggests that when pushed to extremes, a Morty can abandon his core moral principles and adopt the very ruthlessness he once criticized. In Rick, the capacity for cruelty exists within every Morty. Evil Morty simply embraced it fully. The development of yellow portal technology stands as perhaps the most concrete proof that Evil Morty's intellectual capabilities match or even surpass Rick's genius. Rick's green portals represented the pinnacle of interdimensional travel technology, allowing movement between realities within the central finite curve. Evil Morty not only understood this technology but improved upon it, creating portals that could breach the artificial boundary created by the Ricks. This technological achievement required not just understanding Rick's work, but seeing beyond its limitations. It proves that given the right circumstances, a Morty can innovate at the same level as Rick, developing solutions that even the self-proclaimed smartest being in the universe couldn't conceive. What makes this character truly horrifying as a concept isn't just what he does, but what he represents for our understanding of Morty as a character. Evil Morty serves as a dark mirror, showing what our Morty could become if he fully embraced the resentments that occasionally surface throughout the series. Every time our Morty expresses frustration with being treated as expendable, every moment he questions Rick's authority, every instance where he shows unexpected cunning. These are seeds that, in another timeline, grew into the personality we see in Evil Morty. The gap between these characters isn't as wide as we might comfortably believe. The right combination of circumstances could potentially transform our familiar Morty into something resembling this darker version. This shadow self concept becomes especially meaningful when we consider moments where our Morty shows unexpected darkness. When he efficiently dispatches enemies in the Purge episode, when he manipulates Rick into helping him with selfish schemes, when he maintains his vat of acid resentment long enough to elaborate an extended revenge plot, these moments reveal capabilities that align with qualities we see fully realized in Evil Morty. The difference isn't that our Morty lacks these traits, but that he hasn't fully surrendered to them. Each Morty stands at a crossroads between compassion and cruelty, dependence and independence, reaction and calculation. Evil Morty's timeline reveals that every Morty contains the potential for both exceptional compassion and exceptional cruelty. The choices that separate our Morty from Evil Morty aren't predetermined by character, but emerge from responses to experiences. Our Morty retains his humanity partly because, despite everything, he maintains connections to his family, to Rick, however dysfunctional, and to his own moral principles. Evil Morty severed these connections entirely, creating a version of himself defined solely by his own ambitions rather than by relationships with others. This isolation allowed him to develop attributes that remain checked in our Morty, but also cost him the emotional connections that give our Morty's life meaning. Ultimately, Evil Morty's existence poses uncomfortable questions about identity and potential. If our Morty's greatest strength is his capacity for empathy and connection, Evil Morty shows what happens when those qualities are sacrificed in pursuit of independence and power. His character suggests that the traits we associate with Morty, kindness, anxiety, neediness, aren't fixed aspects of his personality but adaptations to specific circumstances. Change those circumstances, and Morty can become something entirely different yet still recognizably himself. This makes our Morty's continued compassion not an inevitability, but a choice. One he makes repeatedly despite having the potential to become something much darker. The Council of Ricks gives us our first real look at multiple versions of Rick interacting with each other in an organized way. When we first see them, they appear like a unified group with identical goals and personalities. They wear the same robes, use the same technology, and seem to share the same arrogant attitude toward the rest of the multiverse. But if we look closer, the Council actually shows us something incredibly valuable. It's basically a psychological spectrum of what Rick Sanchez can become under slightly different circumstances. Each council member represents a different adaptation of the same basic personality and genius intellect. These Ricks all started with the same raw materials: extraordinary intelligence, creativity, and a tendency toward control. but they developed along different psychological paths based on their experiences and choices. Some became bureaucrats, others became enforcers, some became politicians, and others became subordinates. The main Rick C-137 looks at these variants with disgust, calling them a government of Ricks as the ultimate insult. What's fascinating is that this reaction tells us more about our Rick than about the council itself. He can't imagine a version of himself that would accept any authority structure, suggesting his psychological adaptation involves an extreme need for independence. Rick Prime stands out as the most significant variant, showing what happens when Rick's worst impulses go completely unchecked. This version abandoned all moral constraints, even murdering Diane and Beth in some timelines. Rick Prime's actions actually created our main, Rick C-137, whose entire existence became defined by pursuing revenge. Rick Prime represents the darkest path Rick's psychology can take, a complete rejection of family bonds, empathy, and responsibility. He embodies pure selfishness with no redeeming attachments. The contrast between Rick Prime and our Rick shows that even at his worst, our Rick maintains some moral boundaries that Rick Prime gleefully crosses. The bureaucratic Ricks within the council show us something equally interesting about Rick's psychology. These variants channeled their control issues into systems and structures rather than independent adventures. They created the elaborate bureaucracy of the Citadel, with its rules, paperwork, and hierarchy. For a character defined by his hatred of authority, it's fascinating to see versions of Rick who found satisfaction in creating and maintaining authority structures. These bureaucratic Ricks show that Rick's need for control doesn't necessarily manifest as rebellion. It can also appear as a desire to create systems that enforce order on others. They found psychological stability not through freedom, but through creating structures that gave them predictable control. The council leadership offers another psychological variant worth examining. These Ricks found ways to exercise their need for superiority through formal positions of authority. Rather than proving their genius through scientific achievements like our Rick, they satisfy their ego needs through titles, followers, and political power. They created a society where their authority is institutionalized, rather than having to constantly reassert their superiority through individual actions. This represents a completely different adaptation to the same underlying need to be recognized as exceptional. Our Rick must constantly prove his brilliance through new inventions and adventures, while council leaders secured their status in a more permanent, structured way. Perhaps most surprising are the Ricks who accept subordinate roles within the council system. These variants show psychological adaptations that our Rick would find absolutely unthinkable. They follow orders, perform assigned tasks, and function within a hierarchy where they aren't at the top. Some work as factory workers or service providers in the Citadel economy. Our Rick would rather die than accept such limitations, yet these variants found ways to adapt their psychology to accept these positions. They might suppress their ego needs, find satisfaction in contributing to a larger cause, or simply lack the extreme independence that drives our Rick. Their existence suggests that Rick's refusal to be controlled isn't inherent to his character, but a specific psychological adaptation. The council doesn't just represent political organization, but provides a taxonomy of Rick's possible psychological selves. Each variant shows how different aspects of Rick's personality, his need for control, his genius intellect, his ego, can develop along different paths. Some Ricks channel these traits into creating systems, others into enforcing rules, others into leading organizations, and others into finding places within established structures. These adaptations aren't random, but represent different solutions to the same core psychological challenges that come with being Rick Sanchez. The subtle differences between council members reveal unexplored aspects of Rick's psychology, particularly in how they handle authority, relationships, and their own insecurities. Some Ricks need direct control, demanding immediate compliance. Others prefer to manipulate from behind the scenes, creating systems that do their controlling for them. Some need constant validation of their superiority, while others found more stable sources of self-worth. These variations show that Rick's psychology contains multitudes of potential adaptations, with our Rick representing just one possible path his personality could take. The variations in how Council Ricks handle their insecurities particularly reveals dimensions of the character we rarely see in our main Rick. While C-137 drowns his insecurities in alcohol and adventure, some Council Ricks address their insecurities through group membership, finding safety in numbers. Others bury themselves in bureaucratic procedure, creating psychological distance from their emotions through paperwork and protocols. A few seek constant reassurance through their positions of authority. Each represents a different coping mechanism for the same underlying psychological vulnerabilities. Our Rick deals with his insecurities through denial and distraction, but these other variants found alternative adaptations. These psychological variations become most apparent during conflicts within the Council. When faced with threats, different Ricks respond in distinctly different ways. Some immediately assert control, others calculate political advantages, others follow established protocols, and others look to leadership. These varying responses reveal their different psychological adaptations to stress and danger. Our Rick typically responds to threats with immediate, independent action, but Council Ricks show a spectrum of alternative adaptations to the same stimuli, from bureaucratic to authoritarian to collaborative. The Council of Ricks ultimately serves as a psychological mirror, showing the many different ways Rick's personality could develop, given slightly different circumstances. The variations between them aren't random, but represent different adaptive strategies to the same core personality traits. Their existence challenges the idea that our Rick's specific psychological adaptations were inevitable. Instead, they suggest that small differences in experience and choice can lead to dramatically different psychological outcomes, even with the same starting personality. The fact that our Rick regards most of these variants with contempt tells us more about his specific psychological adaptations than about the inherent value of these alternative paths. The main timeline Beth Smith gives us a character defined almost entirely by abandonment trauma. Her father Rick disappeared for most of her childhood and early adult life, leaving her with deep-seated insecurities that manifest in her desperate need for approval. We see this play out in almost every interaction she has with Rick. She laughs too hard at his jokes, defends him against Jerry's criticisms, and constantly seeks validation from him. She became a horse surgeon rather than a human surgeon, settling for what she perceives as a lesser version of her dreams. Her marriage to Jerry stems partly from this same psychological wound. She chose someone who would never abandon her because he lacks the confidence to leave. But across different timelines in the multiverse, we encounter Beth variants who process this same core trauma in completely different ways, creating entirely different life paths. These variants aren't just Beth with different careers or hairstyles. They represent fundamentally different psychological adaptations to the same initial abandonment. Each Beth variant answers the central question of her character: how to deal with Rick's influence in a unique way that creates an entirely different person. Some reject him entirely, others embrace his chaos, and others find middle paths between extremes. Space. Beth represents perhaps the most significant divergence from the main timeline. This Beth chose adventure over stability, embracing a life among the stars as a rebel fighting against the Galactic Federation. She essentially becomes a version of Rick, mirroring his lifestyle of constant movement, danger, and freedom. When we meet Space Beth, she displays confidence and capability that makes the main timeline Beth seem timid by comparison. She wears her hair short, dresses in tactical gear, and carries advanced weapons. This Beth processed her abandonment not by seeking Rick's approval, but by becoming him, adopting his values of freedom, adventure, and resistance to authority. What makes Space Beth particularly fascinating is that she isn't the result of an entirely different timeline. She's a potential fork in the main Beth's own path. Rick offered Beth the choice to leave Earth and pursue adventure while he created a clone to maintain her family life. The genius of this storyline is that neither Beth nor the audience knows which Beth is the clone and which is the original. They are literally the same person who took different paths from the same starting point. This directly challenges the idea that Beth's character is fixed or predetermined. Instead, it suggests her identity depends entirely on her choices rather than any inherent essence. The episode Beth Twinstinct takes this concept to its logical conclusion when the two Beths develop a romantic relationship with each other. This might seem bizarre on the surface, but it actually represents Beth's acceptance of both sides of her nature. The domestic Beth and space. Beth aren't just alternate versions, they're two halves of the same whole person. Their relationship represents Beth taking control of her life by allowing herself to love herself, embracing both the adventurous dreamer and the committed mother within her own psyche. This self-acceptance offers Beth a form of fulfillment that doesn't require either complete rejection or unhealthy attachment to Rick. The Croninberg timeline shows us yet another Beth adaptation when faced with extreme circumstances. In this reality, Rick and Morty accidentally transformed most of humanity into grotesque monsters before abandoning that timeline entirely. The Beth they left behind had to adapt to a post-apocalyptic environment, likely using her veterinary skills to help her family survive. Though we don't see much of this Beth's development directly, her circumstances would force her to become more resourceful, practical, and independent than the main timeline Beth. Without Rick present to define her identity, Croninberg Beth would need to create a new sense of self based on survival rather than approval-seeking. This capacity for adaptation under pressure appears in other Beth variants as well. In timelines where Beth becomes a successful human surgeon, she fulfills her potential while maintaining family connections. These Beths didn't let Rick's absence define them, but instead channeled their intelligence and determination into professional achievement. They represent paths where Beth acknowledged her trauma without allowing it to limit her. These surgeon Beths show that Beth's intelligence rivals Rick's when she applies it, suggesting that her main timeline limitations stem more from psychological blocks than lack of ability. Some of the most psychologically healthy Beth variants appear in timelines where she completely rejected Rick's influence. These Beths established firm boundaries with their father, refusing to let his chaos disrupt their lives. We get glimpses of these Beths who either never reconciled with Rick when he returned or who established clear limitations on his involvement in their families. These variants processed their abandonment by acknowledging it directly rather than seeking to heal it through excessive accommodation. They created lives defined by their own values rather than reactions to Rick's presence or absence. The central tension in Beth's character across all timelines involves balancing her need for connection with her need for independence. The main timeline, Beth sacrifices too much independence in her desperate attempt to maintain connection with Rick. Space. Beth sacrifices too much connection in her pursuit of independence. The most intriguing Beth variants find balance between these extremes, maintaining meaningful family connections while also establishing their own identity separate from Rick's influence. These balanced Beths neither reject Rick entirely nor surrender their autonomy to keep him in their lives. What makes these alternate Beth timelines so compelling isn't just seeing different versions of the character, but understanding how small differences in response to the same trauma create entirely different lives. Each Beth variant starts with the same basic personality traits: intelligence, determination, and a complex relationship with her father. The differences emerge in how they process their abandonment. Some internalize it as personal failure, others transform it into motivation, others use it to justify rebellion, and others work through it to create healthy boundaries. These different psychological adaptations lead to completely different life outcomes. The most intriguing what-if scenarios about Beth's relationship with Rick involve those timelines where she finds fulfillment without either complete rejection or unhealthy attachment. These balanced Beths maintain relationships with Rick without sacrificing their own identities or needs. They can appreciate his genius without seeking his validation. They can enjoy his presence without fearing his absence. They can disagree with him without feeling they've failed him. These Beths achieve what the main timeline Beth struggles toward: a healthy relationship with Rick that doesn't define her entire identity. These Beth variants collectively map the full range of possible responses to parental abandonment, from desperate approval-seeking to complete rejection, with numerous variations between these extremes. Each represents a different answer to the central question of Beth's character: how to define herself in relation to Rick's influence. The main timeline Beth continues to work through this question, occasionally making progress toward healthier boundaries before regressing during moments of insecurity. The existence of these alternate timeline Beths suggests that her journey isn't predetermined. At any point, she could still choose a different path and become a different version of herself, just as each Beth variant chose paths that created their distinct identities. In the main timeline, Summer Smith tends to get sidelined a lot when it comes to the big adventures. The show focuses mostly on Rick and Morty's interdimensional trips, while Summer often stays home or gets included as an afterthought. But whenever we actually see Summer in action, she shows something pretty remarkable. She adapts to new situations faster than anyone else in the Smith family. She doesn't freak out like Morty or get overwhelmed like Jerry or try to analyze everything like Beth. Summer just takes in the new reality and starts figuring out how to work within it almost immediately. This trait might seem minor at first, but when we look at Summer variants across different timelines, we start to realize it might actually be her superpower. Summer's adaptability becomes really clear when we compare how different family members react to strange new environments. Morty usually panics first, then gradually adjusts with Rick's help. Jerry completely falls apart most of the time. Beth tries to maintain control through denial or alcohol. But Summer? She just accepts the new reality and starts working with it. We see this in episodes where she gets included in adventures. She doesn't waste time questioning the impossible or complaining about the situation. She moves straight to, "Okay, this is happening. Now what do we do?" This mental flexibility gives her an edge that becomes even more apparent when we look at her variants across the multiverse. The post-apocalyptic Summer from the Mad Max parody episode shows this adaptability taken to an extreme. When society completely collapsed in this timeline, Summer didn't just survive, she thrived. She quickly understood the social dynamics of the wasteland, adopted the appropriate clothing and speech patterns, and positioned herself as someone of importance within the new power structure. She wasn't just reacting to circumstances, but actively shaping them to her advantage. While Morty remained confused and out of place, Summer immediately grasped the rules of this new world and started playing the game effectively. This version of Summer demonstrates leadership abilities that remain mostly untapped in the main timeline. We also see Summer's quick adaptation skills when she visits the Citadel or encounters other alien environments. While these places leave most characters disoriented, Summer rapidly figures out how they work. She doesn't get overwhelmed by the strangeness like Morty often does. Instead, she observes, processes, and adjusts her behavior accordingly. This social intelligence allows her to navigate complex new environments without needing constant guidance or explanation. She picks up on social cues and power structures that might take others much longer to understand. This ability makes her especially valuable in situations where quick adaptation means survival. One of Summer's most impressive adaptive traits is her ability to form alliances with different versions of Rick. This is no small achievement considering how difficult Rick can be, even in the best circumstances. While Morty's relationship with Rick is defined by their established dynamic, Summer approaches each Rick variant as a new individual to be understood and worked with on their own terms. She doesn't get caught up in expectations based on her experiences with C-137 Rick. This flexibility in her interpersonal approach allows her to connect with Ricks, who might completely dismiss other family members. Her relationships with these alternate Ricks reveal interpersonal skills that surpass those of her parents and brother. What makes Summer's adaptability even more interesting is that unlike Morty, who sometimes seems completely transformed by his experiences, Summer variants maintain consistent core personality traits, even in drastically altered circumstances. Whether she's in post-apocalyptic Australia, or the Citadel, or an alien planet, she remains recognizably Summer. Sarcastic, pragmatic, status-conscious, and ultimately loyal to her family. This consistency across variants suggests a stronger sense of identity than what we see in Morty, who can be more fundamentally changed by his environments and experiences. Summer adapts without losing herself in the process. This ability to maintain her core identity while adapting to new circumstances makes Summer arguably the most consistent character across multiple timelines. While other family members might become unrecognizable versions of themselves when placed in extreme situations, Summer variants typically show the same fundamental character with adaptations appropriate to their circumstances. This consistency likely stems from Summer's stronger sense of self. Unlike Morty, whose identity is often tied to his relationship with Rick, Summer defines herself independently. This self-definition gives her a stable core that remains intact even as she adapts to wildly different environments. Summer's quick adjustment to new realities stands in sharp contrast to how other Smith family members handle change. Jerry typically collapses under pressure, clinging desperately to familiar patterns even when they no longer make sense. Beth often retreats into denial or alcohol when faced with situations that challenge her worldview. Morty frequently panics before slowly adapting with Rick's guidance. Rick himself, despite his multiversal experience, often tries to bend reality to his preferences rather than truly adapting to it. Summer, on the other hand, accepts new realities quickly and starts working within their parameters almost immediately. This adaptability doesn't mean Summer lacks principles or personality. On the contrary, her strong sense of self allows her to flex without breaking. She knows who she is, which gives her the confidence to adjust her behavior without feeling threatened by change. While Morty often questions his identity through his adventures, Summer maintains a clearer sense of herself across different environments. This self-knowledge provides the foundation for her adaptability. She can change her approach without changing who she fundamentally is, which proves to be an incredibly valuable trait in a multiverse of infinite possibilities. What makes this especially interesting is that Summer starts with more conventional teenage concerns than anyone else in the family. She cares about popularity, social media, and typical high school drama. Yet these seemingly ordinary concerns don't limit her when extraordinary circumstances arise. Instead, her understanding of social dynamics transfers surprisingly well to alien societies, post-apocalyptic wastelands, and interdimensional travel. Her attention to status and relationships gives her tools for understanding new environments that more scientifically minded characters like Rick and Beth sometimes lack. Summer reads people while they read situations. Summer's alternate timeline versions demonstrate her adaptability compared to other Smith family members by showing her quicker adjustment to new realities while maintaining her core identity. While Morty often needs time and guidance to adapt, Summer hits the ground running. While Jerry frequently breaks under pressure, Summer bends without breaking. While Beth often retreats from challenging realities, Summer engages with them directly. This consistent adaptability across variants suggests that Summer might actually be the Smith family member best equipped to thrive in the chaotic multiverse that Rick introduced them to. This adaptive advantage isn't flashy like Rick's genius, or obvious like Morty's moral compass, but it might ultimately be more practical for navigating an infinite multiverse of possibilities. In a reality where anything can happen and frequently does, the ability to quickly assess and adapt to new circumstances without losing your core identity becomes incredibly valuable. Summer's variance across timelines suggests that despite her second billing status in the main timeline, she might actually be the family member most naturally suited to the multiverse. Her adaptability allows her to not just survive the chaos, but find ways to thrive within it while remaining recognizably herself. The Croninberg world represents one of the most fascinating examples of character development in Rick and Morty. In Season 1's Rick Potion Number 9, Rick and Morty messed up their world so badly they couldn't fix it, turning most of humanity into grotesque Cronenberg monsters. Instead of dealing with the consequences, they found an alternate reality where they died and literally replaced themselves. But what most people forget is that they left behind their original family, Beth, Jerry, and Summer, to survive in a post-apocalyptic monster world without any help. That abandoned Smith family had to adapt to extreme conditions, and what makes it especially interesting is how they evolved when all the normal societal pressures disappeared. When we first meet the Cronenberg world Smith family in their brief appearance, we're immediately struck by how different they look. They're dressed in makeshift armor made from scraps, they're carrying weapons, and they've clearly been fighting to survive. This isn't just a costume change, though. It's the physical manifestation of who these characters became when everything comfortable was stripped away. Without civilization's rules and expectations, each family member had to rely on core strengths that normally stay hidden in the main timeline. The pressure of survival forced each of them to develop abilities and traits that never emerge when they can rely on modern convenience and Rick's assistance. Jerry's transformation in the Croninberg world is probably the most dramatic and reveals the most about his character. Main timeline. Jerry is basically defined by his incompetence. He can't hold a job, he can't fix things around the house, and he can't stand up to Rick. He's portrayed as weak and dependent on others for validation. But Croninberg Jerry develops unexpected competence and actual leadership abilities when forced to protect his family. He becomes something like a warrior, carrying weapons and speaking with confidence we never see in the main timeline. This suggests that Jerry's incompetence isn't actually an inherent trait. It's a learned behavior that developed in response to a comfortable life and Rick's constant belittlement. When those factors disappeared, so did Jerry's helplessness. This transformed Jerry shows us that main timeline, Jerry actually has potential that remains completely untapped. His weakness isn't his natural state. It's a response to his environment. In the main timeline, Jerry is surrounded by people who expect him to fail, especially Rick, who actively reinforces Jerry's incompetence at every opportunity. Croninberg. Jerry shows what happens when Jerry operates without those negative expectations weighing him down. Without Rick's constant ridicule and with his family genuinely needing his protection, Jerry discovers capabilities within himself that he never knew existed. This suggests that Jerry's limitations in the main timeline are largely self-imposed and reinforced by family dynamics, rather than actual inability. Beth's evolution in the Croninberg world is equally revealing about her character. In the main timeline, Beth is a horse surgeon who drinks too much and constantly seeks her father's approval. She stays in an unhappy marriage partly because she fears abandonment. Croninberg Beth, however, turns her medical knowledge into a crucial survival skill. Her status in the family elevates not because Rick validates her, but because her abilities are objectively valuable in their new reality. She doesn't need external validation when the practical value of her skills becomes obvious. Without the constant anxiety about her father's approval, Beth finds confidence in her actual abilities rather than seeking it through Rick's acknowledgement. This shift shows us that Beth's insecurities in the main timeline aren't rooted in actual inadequacy, but in her relationship with Rick. Croninberg. Beth doesn't have time for the emotional turmoil that plagues main timeline Beth because survival demands her focus on what she can actually do, rather than how others perceive her. Her medical knowledge, which in the main timeline is sometimes played for laughs as just a horse surgeon, becomes life-saving in the Croninberg world. This suggests that Beth's potential has always been there, just overshadowed by her emotional struggles related to Rick's abandonment and subsequent return. Summer's adaptation in the Croninberg world shows yet another dimension of character development under pressure. Main timeline. Summer often focuses on typical teenage concerns: popularity, social media, and identity within her peer group. Croninberg Summer transforms into something like a tribal warrior, embracing combat skills and survivalist mentality. This rapid adaptation reveals Summer's hidden resilience and practical nature. When the social structures that defined her teenage existence disappeared, Summer didn't collapse. She found new ways to define herself that were relevant to their situation. This adaptability might actually be Summer's greatest strength across all timelines. What makes the Croninberg versions of the Smith family particularly fascinating is how their relationships change under pressure. In the main timeline, the family is often dysfunctional, with constant arguments and power struggles. But the brief glimpse we get of the Croninberg family suggests they've actually grown closer through their shared struggle. They work as a unit, each with defined roles that complement each other. This strengthening of family bonds under extreme pressure stands in stark contrast to the main timeline, where comfortable circumstances seem to breed dysfunction. It suggests that the Smith family's problems aren't inherent to who they are, but are partly created by the very comfort they enjoy. This raises interesting questions about the role of adversity in character development. The Croninberg timeline suggests that comfort might actually prevent the Smith family from reaching their full potential. Without urgent survival needs to focus them, they get caught up in petty conflicts and insecurities. When survival becomes the priority, those same character traits that seem like flaws in the main timeline Jerry's need to protect, Beth's medical precision, Summer's social adaptability, become valuable strengths. This doesn't mean the apocalypse improved their lives, but it did reveal capabilities that remain dormant in more comfortable circumstances. The revelation of these hidden strengths and resilience when civilization is stripped away makes the Cronenberg timeline versions of the Smith family particularly valuable for understanding who these characters truly are at their core. They show us that Beth is more than her daddy issues, Jerry is more than his insecurities, and Summer is more than her social concerns. Each contains untapped potential that only emerges when circumstances demand it. Their main timeline flaws aren't fixed aspects of their personalities, but adaptations to their specific environment. Adaptations that can change when the environment changes drastically enough. The Cronenberg-Smith family essentially gives us a glimpse of who these characters might be if they weren't living in Rick's shadow. Without his overwhelming presence and the chaotic adventures he brings, they discover strengths within themselves that never have a chance to develop in the main timeline. This suggests something profound about all the characters, that their development is never finished, that different circumstances bring out different aspects of who they are, and that even characters we think we understand completely might contain surprising depths that simply haven't been revealed yet. The main timeline Jerry Smith we're all familiar with is practically the definition of failure in the Rick and Morty universe. Everything about him seems designed to make us cringe. His unemployment, his neediness, his constant quest for validation from everyone around him. Jerry loses jobs, gets manipulated by aliens, can't stand up to Rick, and generally fumbles through life as the show's primary punching bag. His marriage to Beth constantly teeters on the edge of collapse. His own children don't respect him. And of course, Rick treats him like he's less valuable than the dirt on his shoe. Jerry's insecurities run so deep that he created an entire simulation where he could feel confident, only to have it set to the lowest difficulty setting without his knowledge. But here's what makes Jerry such a fascinating character to study across the multiverse. His failures aren't actually inevitable. They're not built into his DNA or predetermined by some cosmic force. The show frequently hints that Jerry's shortcomings stem more from his specific circumstances and relationships than from who he fundamentally is as a person. The existence of successful Jerry variants across different timelines proves this point. When placed in different environments or making different choices, Jerry actually has the potential to thrive in ways that would shock the main timeline family. One of the most revealing Jerry variants is the one who becomes an advertising executive. This version of Jerry shows genuine creative abilities when given the confidence and opportunity to use them. Remember that the main Jerry once worked in advertising too, but we mostly hear about his failures in that career. The successful advertising Jerry suggests that the creative potential was always there. It just needed the right environment to flourish. This Jerry likely never experienced the constant undermining from Rick that the main Jerry deals with. Without someone constantly telling him he's worthless, this Jerry found the confidence to pitch ideas, take creative risks, and build a successful career around his natural creativity. Then there's the Jerry who never meets Beth at all. This variant is particularly interesting because it shows us a Jerry who develops independence and self-reliance that are completely absent in the main timeline. Without falling into a codependent relationship with Beth and becoming entangled in the chaos that Rick brings, this Jerry had to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. He likely made his own decisions, faced consequences, and built resilience through normal life experiences rather than interdimensional catastrophes. The main Jerry's relationship with Beth often reinforces his worst tendencies. His neediness, his passivity, his willingness to be humiliated just to avoid being alone. The Jerry who never meets Beth shows us that these traits aren't inherent to Jerry's character, but developed through his specific relationship dynamics. Some of the most surprising Jerry variants are the ones who become actual leaders in their communities when separated from Rick's dominating presence. The main Jerry can barely lead himself, let alone others. But without Rick constantly undermining him and reminding everyone of his inadequacies, certain Jerrys discover leadership abilities that never get a chance to develop in the main timeline. These Jerrys might be community organizers, local politicians, or business owners who earn genuine respect from others. They demonstrate that Jerry's potential for competence and authority exists but gets completely smothered in the main timeline by Rick's overwhelming presence and influence on the family dynamic. One particularly meaningful Jerry variant is the one who fully embraces his wind chime hobby. This might not sound like a big success compared to careers or leadership positions, but it represents something equally important: fulfillment through authentic self-expression. The main Jerry constantly tries to be what he thinks others want him to be, especially Beth. He rarely pursues his own interest without apology or hesitation. The wind chime Jerry finds fulfillment not by meeting external standards of success, but by fully embracing something he genuinely loves and finding meaning in it. This represents a form of success that's less about status or achievement and more about personal fulfillment and authenticity. Something the main Jerry never achieves because he's too focused on external validation. What all these successful Jerry variants reveal is that the main timeline Jerry isn't inherently destined for failure. His shortcomings aren't built into his character, but emerge from specific circumstances, particularly his relationship with Rick. When removed from Rick's belittling influence, Jerry shows potential for creativity, leadership, independence, and authentic self-expression. It's Rick's constant undermining, combined with Beth's conditional love and his own resulting insecurities, that keep Jerry locked in his cycle of failure. Without these specific pressures, Jerry actually has the capacity to become quite a different person. The Jerry variants who actually succeed in life tend to fall into two main categories. First are those who never experienced Rick's belittlement in the first place. These Jerrys never had someone actively working to destroy their confidence and remind everyone around them of their inadequacies. Without that constant negative influence, these Jerrys had the space to develop confidence and discover their own capabilities. The second category includes Jerrys who found the courage to define success on their own terms rather than constantly seeking external validation. These Jerrys stopped trying to impress Beth or stand up to Rick and instead focused on what actually brought them personal fulfillment. What this tells us about the main timeline: Jerry is both sad and hopeful. The sad part is that his failures aren't just bad luck or incompetence. They're the product of a family system that's designed to keep him in his place. Rick actively works to maintain Jerry's position at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Beth's approval is conditional on Jerry accepting this position. Even the kids have learned to see their father through Rick's dismissive lens. Jerry's environment constantly reinforces his worst tendencies and never nurtures his potential strengths. The hopeful part is that Jerry's potential for growth and change exists even in the main timeline. If his failures stem from circumstances rather than inherent character flaws, then changing those circumstances could lead to a very different Jerry. We occasionally see glimpses of this when Jerry is separated from the family or from Rick's influence. During the Croninberg apocalypse, Jerry showed unexpected competence and courage. When Rick was absent from the family, Jerry and Beth's marriage improved. These moments suggest that even the main timeline Jerry contains the seeds of the success we see in his variants across the multiverse. In the end, Jerry's success spectrum across infinite timelines doesn't just reveal alternative lives for a single character. It challenges our understanding of identity itself. If Jerry can be so fundamentally different based on his circumstances and relationships, what does that tell us about the nature of personality? Perhaps our own limitations and failures aren't as inevitable as they sometimes seem. Like Jerry, we might contain untapped potential that the right circumstances could bring to light. The multiverse doesn't just give us infinite Jerrys. It gives us infinite possibilities within ourselves. The Citadel of Ricks gives us the biggest collection of Mortys we ever see in the show. It's basically this massive experiment where we get to see what happens to Mortys in all kinds of different situations. Main timeline Morty is just one version, one possibility of who this character can be. But the Citadel shows us Mortys at every stage of development and in basically every social position you can imagine. Some are cops, some are factory workers, some are politicians, and some are just regular citizens trying to get by. This variety lets us see the full range of what Morty could potentially become, depending on his circumstances. What makes the Citadel Mortys so fascinating is how they reveal the complete spectrum of Morty's potential personalities and life paths. Our main Morty starts out pretty timid and insecure, but he grows more confident and capable through his adventures with Rick. The Citadel shows us what happens when you take that basic Morty template and expose it to different environments, different Ricks, and different social pressures. Some Mortys become hardened and corrupt, some become broken and hopeless, and some find surprising ways to thrive despite everything working against them. It's like seeing all the possible futures for our Morty played out simultaneously. Cop Morty is probably one of the most disturbing examples of what Morty can become with just a little bit of power. This Morty works as a police officer in the slums of the Citadel, and he's completely corrupt. He takes bribes, abuses his authority, and treats other Mortys with contempt. What's especially unsettling about Cop Morty is that he seems to enjoy having power over other versions of himself. He calls them Mortys in this dismissive way that sounds a lot like how Ricks talk. You can see that he's internalized all the worst parts of Rick's personality: the arrogance, the callousness, the belief that might makes right. Cop Morty shows us what happens when Morty gets authority without developing the wisdom or compassion to use it responsibly. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we see the factory worker Mortys. These Mortys spend their days doing mind-numbing labor in the simple Rick's wafer factory or other Citadel industries. They wear uniforms, follow orders, and have basically no autonomy or individuality. What's sad about these Mortys is how their natural curiosity and spirit gets completely crushed by their circumstances. Main timeline Morty asks questions, challenges Rick, and maintains his own moral compass even when it's difficult. But the factory Mortys have had those qualities systematically suppressed. They're just trying to survive in a system that treats them as interchangeable parts. These Mortys show how oppressive environments can suffocate the very qualities that make Morty who he is. Campaign Manager Morty represents yet another potential developmental path. This Morty still believes in principles and ideals despite living in the cynical environment of the Citadel. He works for Candidate Morty, who turns out to be Evil Morty, because he truly believes in the possibility of making the Citadel a better place for Mortys. Even after being betrayed and shot, Campaign Manager Morty clings to his evidence folder, still trying to expose the truth. There's something both admirable and tragic about his persistent idealism. He shows that some Mortys maintain their core moral principles, even in the face of repeated disappointments and betrayals, which is a quality we see in main timeline Morty as well. The Citadel even contains Mortys who have undergone physical transformations, but still maintain recognizable Morty traits. Lizard Morty might look completely different, but he still talks and acts like a Morty. Slick Morty has styled hair and a cooler persona, but underneath he's dealing with the same existential questions as other Mortys. Left hand. Morty is literally just a left hand, but somehow still expresses Mortiness in his limited interactions. These physically transformed Mortys suggest something important about identity. That, despite radical physical differences, certain core characteristics remain consistent. It's not Morty's appearance that makes him Morty, but something more fundamental about his personality and perspective. One of the most poignant Mortys we meet is Slick Morty, who ultimately takes his own life. This Morty represents what happens when the hopelessness of being a Morty becomes too much to bear. He's developed a cool, detached persona as a defense mechanism, but underneath he's deeply despairing about his place in the universe. His suicide shows the darkest possible outcome for Morty's development path: complete despair and self-destruction. It's a stark reminder of how psychologically damaging it can be to exist in a universe where you're constantly reminded of your supposed inferiority and replaceability. The Citadel also gives us glimpses of Mortys who find small ways to resist or find meaning despite their circumstances. The Morty School shows young Mortys being educated specifically to serve their Ricks. But even in this controlled environment, some Mortys question their lessons or daydream about different possibilities. The Morty who works at the Morty market maintains a kind of weary dignity despite his mundane job. These Mortys haven't found dramatic ways to rebel like Evil Morty, but they preserve small pockets of individuality and agency in a system designed to deny them both. They represent a middle path between complete submission and radical rebellion. What's fascinating is that all these different Mortys collectively map out the full range of potential development paths for the character. Some become hardened and cynical, some maintain idealism against all odds, some find small ways to assert their individuality, and some break under the pressure. but almost all of them maintain certain recognizable Morty traits: a capacity for empathy, a tendency to question authority, a desire for connection, and a sense that there must be more to life than just serving Rick. These core traits persist across different versions, suggesting they're fundamental to who Morty is regardless of circumstances. The Citadel. Mortys reflect different potential outcomes for our familiar Morty by showing the extremes of what he might become. Evil Morty represents what happens when Morty's resentment and intelligence combine without his empathy. Cop Morty shows what happens when Morty internalizes Rick's worst traits. Factory worker. Mortys show what happens when Morty's spirit gets completely crushed. Campaign manager. Morty shows what happens when Morty maintains his idealism despite everything. By seeing these extremes, we understand the precarious balance that main timeline Morty maintains and the different directions his character could still develop. What makes these variations especially meaningful is that they aren't just random possibilities. They're specific responses to different circumstances and experiences. Each Morty is shaped by his relationship with his Rick, his position in society, and the choices he makes in response to those factors. This suggests that Morty's character isn't predetermined, but constantly evolving based on his experiences and choices. Our main timeline. Morty isn't locked into any particular fate. He contains the potential to become any of these variants depending on the path he chooses and the circumstances he encounters. That's what makes his journey so compelling. The constant tension between these different possible futures that all exist within him simultaneously. The main timeline Rick we've spent all these seasons with basically operates on a core assumption that most fans take for granted: that his incredible intelligence inevitably leads to suffering. Rick C-137 constantly tells us through his actions and sometimes directly that being the smartest person in the universe means understanding how meaningless everything is. His genius seems completely tied to his nihilism, his alcoholism, and his willingness to hurt people to get what he wants. Rick builds incredible technology while telling Morty that nothing matters. He travels across dimensions while remaining emotionally isolated from everyone around him. He can create life and cure death, but can't seem to cure his own pain. This connection between intelligence and misery seems so fundamental to Rick's character that we rarely question it. But the show actually gives us multiple examples of Rick variants who completely break this supposed rule. These peaceful Ricks challenge everything we think we know about the character because they possess the same genius-level intellect, but none of the cynicism or self-destruction. They're still recognizably Rick Sanchez. They have the same basic appearance, the same scientific capabilities, the same fundamental personality template. But they've found ways to exist without the constant suffering that our Rick experiences. These peaceful variants aren't just slightly happier versions of Rick. They represent entirely different approaches to processing intelligence, trauma, and existence. Doofus Rick is probably the most prominent example of a peaceful Rick variant. We meet him when the Council of Ricks assigns him to babysit Jerry, while the other Ricks handle the main plot of the episode. This Rick immediately stands out because of his buck teeth and unusual hairstyle, but the physical differences aren't what make him truly different. Doofus Rick shows genuine kindness to Jerry, taking interest in his hobbies and treating him with respect that no other Rick would ever show. He uses his incredible intelligence to create ovenless brownies just to make Jerry happy. Despite having the same intellectual capabilities as other Ricks, he approaches others with compassion rather than contempt. What's especially revealing is how the other Ricks treat Doofus Rick. They mock him mercilessly, claiming he eats his own feces, which he directly denies, and treating him as inferior. Our main Rick participates in this bullying without hesitation. The other Ricks can't accept a version of themselves who doesn't use his intelligence as a weapon or a shield against emotional vulnerability. Their treatment of Doofus Rick tells us more about their insecurities than about him. They've built their entire identities around the idea that their intelligence makes them superior and isolated. So a Rick who remains kind despite his genius threatens that entire worldview. Simple Rick represents another fascinating peaceful variant. This Rick never left his family to develop interdimensional travel, instead finding fulfillment through his relationship with his daughter Beth. The Citadel of Ricks literally harvested the chemicals from his brain to flavor wafers that gave other Ricks a taste of the contentment they secretly craved. The Simple Rick's commercial we see in the show presents his family-focused existence as simple and even naive. But this perspective comes from other Ricks who can't accept that their life choices might be flawed. Simple Rick found something that eludes our main Rick despite all his adventures and technological achievements: genuine contentment. Simple Rick demonstrates that Rick's genius doesn't require constant adventure, conflict, or external validation. This Rick applied his intelligence to the everyday challenges of raising a daughter and creating a happy home. The fact that the other Ricks exploit his happiness rather than learn from it shows their inability to accept alternative approaches to their shared intelligence. They recognize the value of Simple Rick's contentment. They literally bottle and sell it, but they can't bring themselves to pursue it directly because it would require admitting that their chosen paths might be fundamentally flawed. The show occasionally hints at the existence of Ricks who developed spiritual practices rather than scientific ones, channeling their intelligence toward inner peace instead of external conquest. These Ricks don't feature prominently in the main storylines, but we get references to them existing beyond the central finite curve. They've found ways to process their experiences through meditation, philosophy, or other contemplative practices rather than through science, violence, and substance abuse. Their absence from the main narrative is itself significant. Our Rick seems to deliberately avoid encountering versions of himself who found healthier ways to process similar traumas. This avoidance suggests something profound about our main Rick's psychology. He doesn't want to confront the possibility that his suffering is a choice, rather than an inevitable consequence of his intelligence. Meeting these peaceful Ricks would force him to question his entire worldview, the belief that his pain is the unavoidable price of his genius. It's easier for him to pretend these variants don't exist or to dismiss them as inferior than to consider that they might have figured something out that he hasn't. The central finite curve itself can be seen as Rick's attempt to create a safe space where his philosophy can't be challenged by Ricks who found peace without sacrificing their intellect. What these peaceful Rick variants ultimately reveal about the main Rick is that his pain comes not from his intelligence itself, but from his refusal to process his trauma in healthier ways. Rick experienced terrible loss when his wife and daughter were killed by another Rick. This trauma is real and devastating, but his response to that trauma, isolation, substance abuse, cynical detachment, interdimensional escapism, represents choices he made rather than inevitable consequences of his genius or his loss. The peaceful Rick variants prove this by showing alternative responses to similar circumstances or potential situations. Our Rick wants to believe that his nihilism is simply the price of seeing reality clearly, that his emotional isolation is the inevitable result of being the smartest person in any room. These beliefs protect him from having to confront his choices and potentially make different ones. The existence of peaceful Rick variants challenges this entire defensive structure. They suggest that Rick could process his trauma, form meaningful connections, and find purpose without sacrificing his intelligence or denying reality. His suffering isn't inevitable, it's a choice he continues to make. This might be why Rick avoids these peaceful variants and why the show rarely focuses on them directly. They represent the road not taken. The possibility that Rick's entire worldview is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between intelligence and suffering. The peaceful Rick paradox isn't just that these variants exist. It's that their existence undermines everything our Rick believes about himself and his place in the universe. They show that his pain isn't special or inevitable, but simply one possible response to his circumstances. And acknowledging that would require Rick to take responsibility for his choices in a way he has consistently refused to do throughout the series. The Smith family in the main timeline has pretty set roles that fans all recognize immediately. Rick is the genius scientist who takes Morty on adventures. Beth is the somewhat frustrated horse surgeon who drinks too much wine. Jerry is the incompetent husband who can't hold down a job. Morty is the anxious, easily manipulated grandson. And Summer is the teenager who often gets left out of the main adventures. These roles seem almost like they're fixed in stone, like this is just who these characters are and how they relate to each other. We see this pattern play out episode after episode, with minor variations but the same basic structure intact. But one of the coolest things about Rick and Morty is how it uses the multiverse concept to show us that these family dynamics aren't actually fixed at all. They're completely dependent on circumstances. Across different realities, we see the Smith family with their roles completely flipped around, creating family systems that function in totally different ways than what we're used to. These role reversals aren't just fun what-if scenarios. They actually tell us something important about who these characters are at their core, and how much of their personalities are shaped by their relationships rather than some unchangeable essence. Some of the most interesting alternate timelines are the ones where Jerry becomes the family's primary protector. This completely transforms his relationship with Beth, who in the main timeline often treats him with barely concealed contempt. When Jerry takes on a protective role, the whole power dynamic shifts. Beth doesn't look down on him anymore, and their relationship becomes more balanced or even tilts in Jerry's favor. Jerry's self-esteem improves, which changes how he interacts with everyone. He doesn't need constant validation because he's already secure in his role. This change ripples through the entire family system, affecting how everyone relates to each other. Then there are realities where Morty is actually smarter than Rick, which creates this fascinating mentor-mentee reversal. In the main timeline, Morty is constantly learning from Rick, following his lead, and gradually picking up scientific knowledge. But in timelines where Morty's intelligence surpasses Rick's, we see an entirely different dynamic. Rick might become the follower, the one who needs guidance and protection. Or he might resent Morty's intelligence and try to undermine him, much like how he treats other Ricks who challenge his intellectual superiority. This inversion challenges our whole understanding of their relationship and reveals aspects of both characters that remain hidden in the main timeline. Some dimensions show Beth as the adventurous explorer, while Rick maintains the household, which basically flips the core premise of the entire show. Instead of Rick dragging Morty away from his normal life, it's Beth who can't stay still, who needs to explore the universe and discover new things. This version of Beth has followed through on her childhood dreams instead of settling for what she sees as a compromised life. Rick, meanwhile, finds fulfillment in creating a stable home environment, perhaps because he's already had his fill of adventure, or because he's trying to make up for his absence in the main timeline. This role reversal highlights Beth's unfulfilled desires in the main timeline and suggests that Rick's adventurous nature isn't as integral to his character as we might think. There are even timelines where Summer becomes the scientific genius of the family, revealing aptitudes that are rarely explored in the main timeline. Main timeline. Summer is smart and adaptable, but she's not portrayed as having Rick's scientific brilliance. In these alternate realities, Summer's intelligence takes center stage, and she becomes the one creating portals, building devices, and understanding. The multiverse. The rest of the family might orbit around her the way they orbit around Rick in the main timeline. This change showcases Summer's intelligence and resourcefulness in ways that the main show rarely has time to explore, suggesting that her typical teenage concerns might be circumstantial rather than essential to her character. What makes these role reversal timelines so fascinating is that they don't just swap jobs or hobbies. They transform the fundamental ways these characters relate to each other. Power shifts, respect is redistributed, and everyone's self-image changes as a result. A Jerry who protects his family doesn't need Beth's validation. A Beth who explores the universe doesn't resent Rick for the opportunities she missed. A genius Summer might view her parents differently than the mainstream Summer does. These changes create entirely new family systems with different patterns of conflict, cooperation, and communication. The existence of these drastically different yet still functional family systems suggests that the Smith family's dynamics are circumstantial rather than essential. Their relationships aren't determined by who they inherently are, but by the roles they happen to occupy in relation to each other. Change those roles, and you change everything about how they interact. This is actually pretty hopeful when you think about it. It means the dysfunctions in the main timeline family aren't inevitable. They're the product of specific circumstances that could potentially change. The timeline that showcases the most drastically different family dynamic among the Smiths is probably the one where Jerry leads interdimensional adventures while Rick maintains domestic stability. This completely inverts the show's primary power structure. In the main timeline, Rick constantly belittles Jerry, undermines his position in the family, and makes him feel inadequate at every turn. Jerry is defined by his relationship to Rick almost as much as Morty is. But in this inverted timeline, Jerry becomes everything Rick is: adventurous, confident, capable of navigating the multiverse, while Rick takes on the domestic role that Jerry usually occupies. This inversion would transform every relationship in the family. Beth would relate to Jerry as the exciting adventurer rather than the disappointing husband. She might see Rick as the stable presence she never had in her childhood. Morty might look up to Jerry instead of Rick, completely changing his development and self-image. Summer might have a completely different view of masculinity and authority with these role models switched. The entire emotional architecture of the family would be reconstructed from the ground up. What makes this particular role reversal so powerful is that it directly addresses the central conflict that drives so much of the show's family drama: the rivalry between Rick and Jerry for position and respect within the family. By completely flipping their roles, this timeline forces us to consider how much of their conflict stems from their inherent personalities versus their circumstantial positions. It suggests that in different circumstances, Jerry could embody many of the traits we associate with Rick, and Rick could adapt to a life more like Jerry's. These role reversals ultimately remind us that the characters we've come to know are just one possible version of themselves. In a multiverse of infinite possibilities, the Smith family exists in countless configurations, each revealing different aspects of who these characters could be. Their personalities aren't fixed or predetermined, but constantly shaped by their circumstances and relationships. That's what makes watching their adventures across different realities so fascinating. We're not just seeing different versions of the same characters, we're seeing the full spectrum of who they could become. The main timeline, Rick's relationship with Beth, is probably the most complicated relationship in the entire show. Rick left Beth when she was a little girl and stayed away for 20 years. This abandonment created this massive wound in Beth's psyche that affects literally everything she does as an adult. She constantly tries to win Rick's approval, she drinks too much wine, and she stays in a bad marriage partly because she's afraid of people leaving her again. The whole foundation of their father-daughter relationship is built on this empty space where Rick should have been but wasn't. When Rick finally returns, Beth desperately wants to connect with him, but Rick keeps her at emotional arm's length, creating this cycle where she tries harder and harder to get his approval while he remains distant. But what's really interesting about Rick's fatherhood is that when we look across different timelines, we see completely different versions of this same relationship. There are Ricks who never left their Beths at all. These Ricks stuck around, raised their daughters, and created family structures that look nothing like the main timeline. In some of these realities, Beth never develops the abandonment issues that define her character in the main timeline. She doesn't have the same desperate need for her father's approval because he was always there giving it to her. These family units tend to be more stable emotionally, but they're not always perfect. Sometimes the Ricks who stayed become controlling or stifling, creating Beths who never developed independence because their father's overwhelming presence didn't give them room to grow. Then there are timelines where certain Ricks left, but came back much earlier. They might have returned when Beth was still a teenager, rather than waiting until she was an adult with her own family. These earlier returns created totally different relationship dynamics. Teenage Beth would have been in a different developmental stage when Rick returned, leading to different kinds of bonds forming between them. These Beths might have had Rick's influence during critical years when they were making decisions about their futures, their careers, and their relationships. Some of these Beths probably became more like Rick as a result, adopting more of his attitudes and approaches to life because they had him as a model during their formative years. One of the most interesting Rick-Beth relationships we see is in the Space Beth storyline. This Rick actually created a clone of Beth so that one version could stay with the family while another version could go off and have adventures in space. What's fascinating about this decision is how it shows Rick's conflicting desires as a father. He wants to give Beth freedom to pursue her dreams and become her own person, but he also wants to protect her and maintain their connection. Instead of making a choice between these options, he creates a scenario where both can happen simultaneously. This is basically Rick using his scientific genius to solve an emotional problem. He wants Beth to be both free and protected, both independent and connected. So he creates a situation where she can be both at once. The most troubled Ricks in the multiverse are often the ones who lost their Beths to tragedy. These are Ricks whose Beths died, either in the same incident that killed Diane or in some later tragedy. These Ricks tend to become the most damaged and nihilistic versions of the character. Without Beth as an emotional anchor, these Ricks spiral into even deeper cynicism and detachment than the main timeline Rick. They often give up on any pretense of caring about anything or anyone. The fact that these Ricks become so much worse without Beth in their lives shows just how important she is to Rick's emotional stability, even if he rarely admits it. Even the main timeline Rick, for all his emotional distance, still has Beth in his life as a connection to something beyond himself. What's clear from looking at all these different versions of the Rick-Beth relationship is that Rick's approach to fatherhood serves as the emotional cornerstone that determines his entire personality across different timelines. The decisions Rick makes about his relationship with Beth fundamentally shape who he becomes. Ricks who stay become different people than Ricks who leave. Ricks who lose Beth become different still. This connection suggests that for all Rick's talk about the meaninglessness of family and emotional attachments, his relationship with his daughter actually forms the foundation of his identity across the multiverse. Rick's relationships with different Beths across timelines reveal his complex feelings about fatherhood by showing his simultaneous desire for connection and freedom, protection, and independence. Rick wants to be close to Beth, but he also wants his own space. He wants to protect her, but he also wants her to be strong and independent. He wants to be a father, but he's terrified of the vulnerability that comes with that role. These conflicting desires create the tension that defines their relationship in every timeline. Different Ricks resolve this tension in different ways, some by staying, some by leaving, some by creating elaborate sci-fi solutions like cloning their daughter. The Space Beth situation really exemplifies this conflict within Rick. He clearly loves Beth enough to want her to be happy, to fulfill her potential and pursue her dreams. But he also loves her enough to want her safe at home with her family. Rather than choosing between these options, he creates a solution where both can be true. This is Rick at his most father-like, trying to give his daughter everything she needs even when those needs seem contradictory. It's one of the rare moments where we see Rick using his scientific genius not for selfish purposes but to try to make someone else's life better, even if his methods are questionable. In the main timeline, Rick's approach to fatherhood is defined by absence followed by partial presence. He wasn't there for most of Beth's life, and even when he returns, he maintains emotional distance. He lives in her garage, he eats meals with the family, but he rarely opens up or shows genuine vulnerability. Yet, even this limited presence has a profound effect on Beth's life and on the entire Smith family. It raises questions about what kind of father Rick could have been if he'd made different choices, if he'd been present for Beth's childhood, or if he'd been more emotionally available upon his return. The multiverse of different Rick-Beth relationships shows us that Rick's fatherhood isn't fixed or predetermined. It's a series of choices that could always have gone differently. There's no single right way Rick approached being a father across the infinite timelines. Instead, there are countless variations, each with their own benefits and costs, their own joys and sorrows. The Rick we follow made his choices and now lives with their consequences. But the existence of these other Rick-Beth relationships hints at the roads not taken, the father he could have been in different circumstances or with different choices. After exploring all these twisted timelines, we discover something pretty important about Rick and Morty's characters. They aren't stuck being one way just because that's who they are. Every version of them shows us they could have turned out completely different based on their experiences and choices. Each variant reminds us that the main characters we follow contain all these possible versions within themselves. That's what makes their decisions matter. They're actively choosing who to become among infinite possibilities. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think about which version of yourself might exist in another timeline, and what that says about who you truly are at your core.